Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, we're going to start in about a couple minutes, so if you are out there waiting, then let's just wait a little bit more and then we can begin in due course. So just hold tight and we will begin momentarily. So, but it's nice to see you and I hope all of you are doing very well. So, let's see. So, I suppose in the interim, while we're waiting, I can just say that we will be talking about this film, which is Afterlife. This is the Japanese Blu-ray of the film Afterlife. It's a 1998-1999 film, and so this is a film directed by Hirokazu Koreeda. And so I will be talking about this film during the course of this live stream. So let's just sit back and we'll wait for maybe a minute and a half or so before we are underway. So let's just wait a couple more minutes and then we can get started. I hope the sound is okay. If it is okay, then I'm pretty good. Yes. So great. Excuse me while I have a sip of water. Okay, we can begin shortly. Hold on, let me just adjust this slightly, excuse me. There we go, I think that's better. Yeah, that's better. Okay. All right, we will begin in a moment. So the live chat I see is underway. I will get to that in 1 second. And yes, so very good. Very good indeed. Okay, so why don't we begin then? It's 10:59, but I think we can just begin with the preliminary stuff, and then let's get underway with the discussion itself. So, greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope you are all doing very well today. Today is Saturday, March 14th, 2020. And so today it is my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to discuss with you this film, which is Hirokazu Koreeda's film called Afterlife, or in Japanese, Wonderful Life. This is a film from 1998, 1999, around that area. And this is a very poignant and beautiful work that is one of the more complex works that I've ever come across. And hopefully I'll be able to explain as to why I think this work is actually quite dense and complex. And amongst that also, I think it is a very rewarding work, sometimes quite challenging, and very powerful. It has some scenes of profound poignancy that I would think have a reach that is universal. It's not necessarily relevant only to the Japanese experience, to put it in those broad terms, but also I think on the more human or the broad level of universal human truths, whatever those may be. I think this film hits upon a number of things that I think are quite universal, and that's something that I will try to explain and try to argue for later in this live stream. So I'd like to suggest that this is a powerful work, an emotional work, but also a very deceptive work. And it's one that I think plays around a lot with notions of truth and fiction, the concept of lying and lies, and also the importance of memory and what memory is or what it constitutes, and how it plays a role not only in shaping our relationships with the people around us, but also in shaping our relationship with ourselves and providing to us a kind of sense of being or meaning, something that is rooted in what it is to exist, a kind of existential mode, if you will, of looking at memory. Of course, it's not just that. It's not just a treatise on these sorts of concepts. I think it also has at its heart a number of stories that I think are very moving. And hopefully we can get to some of those later in this live stream. So this is the film Afterlife, or Wonderful Life. So hopefully you will, you have seen this film, and if you have, I'd love to hear what it is you have to say about this film. Okay, so just a couple of preliminary points before we get underway. So this is a film club live stream, and so as per usual, I will be talking about this film in some detail, which includes talking about the film's ending. And so I think it is worth watching the film first before watching this live stream, because I will be talking about the ending, how it resolves certain of its plot narrative threads, etc. And so the last thing I want to do is spoil this film for you. So if you haven't seen this film, then I would suggest that you turn off this live stream, and you don't have to watch this now. You can always come back later, at a later time, and watch this as a video. And you can leave comments at that point if you feel up to it, of course. And I'm always there to listen to what it is you have to say. But I just urge you, please, if you haven't seen this film, please, I would strongly suggest that you don't watch this live stream, because I will be talking about certain specific details of the plot. So that's one point I want to bring up. The other point I want to bring up is I am, as with everything, approaching this not as any professional film critic, nor as any direct participant in the making of this film. And I don't claim to have any primary knowledge of this, and I don't claim to have studied this film in any kind of professional setting or any academic setting. I'm looking at this film purely as a fan of this film. I've seen this film a number of times since it was first released in theaters in North America in, I think, around 1999. And I remember seeing it. It was a very vivid experience for me, and it was something that I was quite moved by, to the extent that I went back and saw the film in the same theater many times. It was really that moving to me. And then later on in life, I would watch the film again. And so now I have this Blu-ray. And so this is a film that I've seen so many times, and it means a lot to me on so many levels. I am approaching this film, therefore, as a real fan of this film. But I don't claim to be an expert. I don't claim to know every little detail of this film. I wish I did, but I don't. I certainly don't, and I don't claim to. I will try to present certain hypotheses, if you will, or make some, to surmise about certain things that come up in this film that seem to suggest one thing or another, but they are only guesses, and I will make sure I make myself clear during this live stream before I say something that I really mean to be pure conjecture on my part. So there's that, right? And then the other thing is, you are free to talk in the live chat. It's open, and I'm always very happy to hear what it is you have to say about this. So that's hopefully something that you can enjoy, and you can ask me questions, or you can ask each other questions, and you can talk about this film, etc. Wonderful, wonderful. I'm all ears, and please welcome, welcome, welcome. It's always nice to see you. I will just say this. I will do my best to address every comment that I can, but please note that I am only human, and so I do make mistakes, and I do commit certain oversights, unintentional, of course, but sometimes I will unintentionally skip or miss a comment or question, and if that's the case, I apologize in advance. It's not my intention to do so, but it does happen with a certain amount of frequency, unfortunately. But please, I ask for your understanding on that point. I will certainly do my best. And also, I must say that because this live stream is talking about the film Afterlife, that I will be focusing my energy on questions or comments that are talking directly about this film. So if you have any questions or comments for me that aren't related to the film Afterlife, then I will, with all due respect, I will just skip over those for now. I'm sure we can talk about it during another occasion or on another video or something like that. I'd be very happy to do so. But for now, I'd just like to focus my energy and attention on the film Afterlife. And so if there are any comments or questions directed to me that are unrelated to this film, I will just with great respect, just skip over them very gently, and we will move on. If you want to leave a comment or question about something else, there are many other videos on this channel, and if you want to leave a comment behind, you're very free to do so. I will do my best to get back to you to the extent that I am able. So that is the situation with that. So with that in mind, my friends, let us begin in earnest with this. And finally, my friends, I want to thank you very much. I tried this live stream the same time last week with quite, it didn't work out very well in terms of technical issues, but today it looks like the stream is flowing somewhat smoothly, or relatively speaking anyway, and so I hope the sound is okay, and the image quality and the buffering is all okay, but it looks on my end to be okay. So fingers crossed. Let's hope everything remains free from any technical issue going forward. And once again, thank you very much for your understanding and your patience and the like. So I will be now talking about this film. So let's go forward with this. So Afterlife, or in Japanese, Wonderful Life. Where to begin a discussion of this film as a kind of opening statement, if you will? I think there are so many ways to approach this, but I would say, as a kind of a potential opening, is I think what we can all agree on, or at least what I think this film is primarily focused on, if we could talk about it in very, very broad terms. Two things, I think, two major things. There might be more, but I think from my point of view, in terms of trying to set up and fashion a discussion, a foundation for a discussion, I think we can focus in on two things, and then we can lead, that can lead to other discussions going forward, of course. But the first thing is this concept of memory. Okay, I know that's very broadly put, but in very, very broad terms, the concept of memory on the one hand, okay, and how memory seems to figure in to what it is we see about ourselves, what it is we find important in our lives, what it is we focus our energy on, because it does take a certain type of energy to recall something, to remember something. What is it about something that we choose that tells us a little bit or a lot about who we are as individuals? What is it about the content of that memory itself that shows to us some kind of evidence of life or having lived life? What is it about choosing one particular memory that is in itself a very significant act? Or, maybe to put it another way, what is it about not choosing a particular memory that is also in and of itself a very significant act? There's something very interesting about how this film deals with the concept of memory and remembrance, both in a positive, and I mean a positive as in a pro-assertive way, as in a positive way, but also in a non-assertive way or a negative way. There are many instances where this film tackles this idea of memory in terms of a positive assertive way, but also a non-assertive negative way. And I think we see that, for instance, most clearly in the character of Isaiah, the young man. I think he's 21 years old, and he refuses to choose a memory. It's not that he cannot choose, but he doesn't want to choose. He makes a decision to not choose a particular memory by the deadline that is set forth in this particular film, right? And so that is a certain kind of statement, if you will. And I will try to get into that specific narrative thread in the film, the Isaiah thread line, which I think is very, very interesting and one of the most important aspects of this film. But that, I think, is an example of how this film shows a kind of negative, and I mean non-assertive meaning of the term, a negative approach to how memory is formed. I think also there is another instance of another character, Yamamoto. He's the man with glasses. He's slightly balding. We don't see him very much, but he seems to be very morose and quite dark, and there's a point where we see the back of his head, and it's Mochizuki and Shiori who are the people in charge. Mochizuki is in charge of his particular case, right? And we see the back of his head, and I want to say it's Wednesday, and what he says is, this idea is that if I choose a memory of, and I'm paraphrasing, if I were a young kid, like 7, 8, or 9 or something, and I can focus, that means I can focus in on this memory, and that means I can forget about everything else. Well, that is heaven indeed. And so that's a very interesting concept too, which is exemplified in the Yamamoto storyline, which is that not only is this idea of choosing a memory very important in this system that's set up in this world that is created by the Koreeda film, and the assertion of trying to have a memory that is made up of people and images and feelings and colors and things like that. But also there is this idea that a memory that is chosen can be the antithesis of that. And in fact, the Yamamoto storyline, if you recall, Mochizuki reveals that Yamamoto ends up choosing a memory of when I think he was 5 years old, and he was in a little cupboard or something that had all these little trinkets in it, and it was this little hideaway space, and it was the darkness, and that's all he focused in on, was the darkness. And so that is a very negative, as a non-assertive meaning of the term, negative view of memory. It's something that has no image. It's only just a feeling or sound, perhaps. But I think that is an example of how this film deals with it. It's not just a one-way kind of approach to memory, but it's a very multifaceted approach to it. And also, because of its very multifaceted nature, I think it does allow for different avenues of discussion as to the significance of memory and the significance of picking one solitary moment in time from one's past, or what one remembers one's past to have been. And so I think that is a very kind of a powerful thing, especially when considering that we are looking at this concept of memory through these different stories. And so there are many different ways in which this concept of memory can be changed depending on one's subjective experience. And so I think there are a lot of potential discussion is brought to the table just with this main aspect of the film, right? Because just stepping back, right, the whole conceit of the film, right, is that people have died and they come to this place, wherever it is. It's some kind of place that it might be that zone between heaven and earth. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but it is a place where people have to stay for a limited amount of time, 1 week, where they arrive on Monday and they leave on Saturday. That's the general. So it's less than a week, but the idea is that they are there and they have to choose one memory, and that one memory will then be recreated by this team. And then the recreation of the memory will be captured on film. And then the people who have died will watch the film in a group setting, which is also a very interesting concept, which hopefully I'll be talking about later. But once the people in the group setting watch their film of their memory that has been recreated for film, then the idea is then they go to what's known as the other place, or in Japanese, achirae, over there. So wherever that is. And so that's the conceit of the film. Very clever. But rather than focus in on any kind of religious connotations of this, rather than talk about the specific explanations of what this place is, how the physics of this place work, what goes on, how does, for instance, how does Shiori end up suddenly in the real world, like is she walking around like a Wim Wenders angel or something like that, or is there something else going on? And is this heaven, or is this some kind of concept of that, or not really? The film doesn't focus on that primarily, of course. It's very vague when it comes to those moments of possibly explaining this in religious terms. There are some times when the idea of hell and heaven come up. The concept of heaven comes up in that moment with the character of Yamamoto, which I just described a few moments ago. The concept of hell also comes up when Iseya, the young man who refuses to choose a memory, and he is first being interviewed by it's Kawashima, who is the person in charge of his case. And he says, all that stuff that we were told as kids, if you do something bad, you're going to go to hell or something. That's all. That's not true. Everyone goes to the same place. And Kawashima confirms that. And so that is the sort of discussion that is devoted to this idea of religious connotations. So as you can see, the focus of the film is not that angle, I would assert, but rather it is the idea of memory and the focus in on what memory means. Okay, that's not to say that this film is bereft of any kind of, let's say, social connectiveness or any kind of indication of maybe not necessarily religious ideas in society, but also there are elements of Japaneseness in this film that I will also try to get into if I have the opportunity going forward. So it's not just a focus in on memory, but that's the primary focus, I would assert. And I think that's a good place to go because it's related to the second major component of this film for purposes of broad discussion anyway. So first there's memory, and then the next major component, I would argue, is the concept of truth and fiction, or truth and lies. Now, I understand that there's a distinction between fiction and lying, and also I understand that there is a distinction within the group of lying. There are further subcategories that can be made. white lies or little fibs on the one hand, or malicious, intentional lies that are akin to, say, fraud or something like that. So there is this wide berth of a category when we talk about lying itself. And I understand this is also different from fiction, but also I think in a broad sense we can understand that maybe lying and fiction can be set forth in the same broad category when we're talking about reality and what is not real. Okay, and I think this is also a very key concept in this film, because this is something that is brought up in many different layers in this film. It is brought up in the concept of how this film presents the stories and the actors that are portraying these particular characters that we see on screen and how they are recounting their stories. Now, I will go into this in more detail, but on the whole, in general, it would seem that a number of the characters that we see are being played by professional actors. They are not really who they are being portrayed as being in the film, but they are actors, right? They are actors that are playing characters that have names different from their real life names, etc. And they are playing these characters. But there are also a group of people in this film that seem to be non-professionals that are in this film, and they seem to be talking as non-professionals. So on that basis, on a kind of surface level anyway, this film might be seeming to, on the surface anyway, be trying to indicate to us, the viewer, that yes, it is aware of this issue, that there is this idea of truth and fiction that this film is trying to deal with, narrative and documentary. This film has often been described as being part documentary, or a hybrid between narrative and documentary, because of these other participants that seem to be non-professional actors, right? And this is a very interesting concept, because I would actually assert that it's not necessarily as clear as one might think. I would actually assert that maybe there is more maybe there is more non-truth going on than one might think. And I think that blurring of the line between truth and non-truth, I think, is one of the things that makes this film very fascinating. And I would even go so further, which I'll try to elaborate on with more detail later. I would go so further as to say that just because something is a lie or a non-truth doesn't make it bad. And I would actually assert that this film seems to be positing this. And it seems to be doing so in the way in which it carries through with some of its storylines, and how this idea of not telling the truth is sometimes just a part of human nature. Sometimes it's a part of sort of linguistic habits, societal concerns, etc. There's also something of a psychological barrier or protection that is also inherent in that. There is also a sort of self-preservation sort of thing that is going on there, I think, as a sort of human psychological level of it. But there's also something to be said about the reliability of human recollection and the like. And so this is all to say that just because something is a non-truth or a lie or a fiction doesn't necessarily make it bad, but it's something that I think the film is dealing with on a very, very complicated level, and I find it to be very fascinating. So there's that aspect of the truth, non-truth. There's another aspect of this truth, non-truth bigger topic that I think is worth mentioning, and I'll try to talk about it later, which is this idea of the memory, right, which is what we were talking about before. The memory is something that is we are remembering, and so to us, we think that the memory is real, and so we can look at these people as they're talking about their memories, and we can understand that to them the memory is real, right? So maybe there is a kind of truth that is based on a subjective viewpoint. But when it's trying to be recreated objectively by third parties that are outside of your mind, that are people that are these in this place, and they have a crew, and they're trying to make a film set and all this stuff, and we see all the little tricks of how they're trying to make the little moment and capture it on film, it looks very fake. We see behind the scenes, and we see how things are being made, and it has a kind of fake quality to it, which I think it goes in very nicely with this idea of lack of truth, if you will. I mean, things are being made up, which is essentially a fiction or a lie. But I would also suggest that that is a very complex presentation of this particular idea, because I think it can go one of two ways. It can sort of negate the whole concept of the importance of memory, but also it can actually go the opposite way. I would assert that it could also potentially go in a way that would support the idea of the power of memory as the subjective experience, and how we as people interact with our own memories. What is it about seeing something that reminds us of something that happened in our life? Is it the thing that's important to us, or is it the fact that it reminds us of something that happened to us that is the important thing? It's the act of being able to remind us, that sort of thing. And therefore, we can think of the film creation or the recreation as serving that kind of function, which I think is a good function indeed. And so there's a very complex way of seeing this idea of truth and fiction, things being made up, lies. But not all lies are bad, as I would assert this film seems to be saying. And so, as you can see, I think these two major big topics, they overlap in many respects. And so this is the general approach that I'd like to guide my own comments going forward today. So memory and truth and fiction, so truth and lies. So let's see. So before we continue, let us go to the live chat and see what it is you are saying, and then we can go forward. So let's see. Paul Emery is here. Hello. Jemez is here. Thank you very much, my friend. Elliot Cohen, our dear friend Elliot, is here. Thank you very much. And I think Elliot has just put up yet another video, a great one about Criterion titles. And so that's a really good one. And also he has a great podcast on Elliot Cohen YouTube channel. So check it out if you haven't already. David Griffin, our dear friend, is here. Hello. You say, I love this humane and moving film. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very glad to hear that, my friend. Jonas Wilstrup is here. Hello. It's nice to see you. JR62 says, hi, Daisuke. Would it be better if I had some knowledge of Japanese religions to better understand this film, or is this an art house sci-fi film? I don't think one necessarily needs a background or knowledge of Japanese religions per se. There are a couple of references to Japanese religion. There's one very specific reference to Japanese religion, or an aspect of Japanese religion, that is actually a kind of clue as to how this film is operating. And I will get to that in a second, but it involves the character, or the personage of Tatara Kimiko, or Kimiko Tatara, who is the elderly lady that we first see. She's number one, and she's with Mochizuki, and she's the elderly lady who talks about her deceased brother, and also she's talking about the dances that she went to, and the red shoes, and the little dance that she did, and the red dress that she wore, and that. So there is one reference that she actually makes in a very key moment in the film, that is a reference to religion, but apart from that, it's not overt. But apart from that, there's no direct reference to religion, as I had tried to assert in my opening comments. And so I don't think that one necessarily needs a kind of reference to that. I mean, I think probably there are some religious-ish types of imagery or images that might conjure up just general impressions of a religious nature, not specific to Japanese religion, mind you, but just religion in general. So maybe the early shot of the doorway and the white clouds behind, whatever they are, and we see the silhouettes of the people entering the building for the first time. They go to the entrance and they go through. So has a kind of unearthly quality to it. There's also the logo that's used for this place, whatever it is. It has two rings. There's one ring, and then there's another ring that's around it. So I always am reminded of like halos, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. So there are certain things that one could see in this film that have a kind of generalized religious connotation if one wants to see it that way. But I don't think that is the main focus of the film, and therefore I don't think that it's absolutely necessary to have a deep understanding of religion or Japanese religion in order to appreciate this film. So great. Andreas, 1999, hello, it's nice to see you. Alan is here, my dear friend, it's nice to see you as well. Wolfgratz, yes, let us try again. Yes, indeed. Right. If at first you don't succeed. And let's see here. Agloinda Hobbit is here, hello. Zyrother is here, hello. Alan says, this is a movie that stays with you long after the viewing. I've pondered what memory I choose and struggled with that. Yes, it's an interesting kind of thought experiment that this film encourages. Namely, if you had to choose one memory, what would it be? It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, and it's actually a very intimate process. It's something that is really quite intimate, I would assert. And actually, this brings me to a particular point. It's kind of a tangential point, but it brings me to a point about this which I find very interesting, which is the whole setup of this whole world that is being created. You know, these people seem to be like they feel like there's a sort of bureaucratic mentality going on here. There's a process that has to be followed. There are these people who work here. There's the boss, who is Nakamura. There's a slightly elderly gentleman, and then there are the people who work directly with the deceased. So there's Sugie, and there's Kawashima, and then there's Mochizuki. So there's three people. So if you recall, they've been assigned each a certain number of people to look after. This time, what is it? It's 22 people. So Sugie and Mochizuki each get 7. So 7 and 7 is 14. And then Kawashima gets 8. And then there is a young woman who we later learn is, I think, 18 years old, and her name is Shiori, and she seems to be with Mochizuki. She's with him in their room when Mochizuki is talking with the various people that he is in charge of. They also seem to have a little bit of a kind of relationship that's based on that. They have a bit of a rapport, and it's also revealed later that Shiori, the young girl, might be having certain feelings for Mochizuki that are beyond sort of professional relationship that they seem to have. They seem to be bordering on something more personal and more intimate, and so that forms a kind of sort of an emotional core, one of many, I would suggest, of this film going forward. But as far as the scheme is concerned, it's a very peculiar one. Because I would actually suggest that there are certain things about this that seem to go against the concept of the sanctity of memory and the intimate nature of how we view memories. Sometimes memories are very personal, and so personal that you don't necessarily want to share them. You know what I mean? There's sometimes quite a cathartic act about talking about memories, and indeed we see the participants in this film talking about memories. We see a number of them anyway, talking out what it is they remember, and picking a story from that, and so sometimes there's something really quite cathartic and therapeutic about talking it out or talking about something. But excuse me, on the other hand, there is also something to be said about choosing something that is very personal to you, that you will then remember for the rest of eternity, whatever it is, right, in the afterlife. And I always thought that there is something, on the one hand, that's very, very charming about this world and the bureaucratic process of choosing a memory and all this stuff. But there's also something that is quite, interestingly intrusive about the way that this whole place works, and right, because it's all the films, for whatever reason, are being seen by everyone in the theater. It's not like a one-on-one thing. Everyone is seeing them all at the same time, which is a very interesting thing. Also, if you recall later, there's the whole plot line with Watanabe, the elderly gentleman who can't quite decide on a particular memory, and this is a sort of reflective of how he has lived a sort of what he called a so-so life. He had a so-so education, a so-so job, a so-so marriage. Nothing very memorable. He wanted it to be memorable, but it ended up being very, very normal and very ordinary. And so, right, his wife, Kyoko, forms a very crucial part in the Mochizuki storyline, as we know. And once the participants have left, on that Saturday, then Shiori and us, the audience, begin to realize the truth that this woman used to be the sort of the intimate lover, if you will, of Mochizuki when he was young and alive, before he died from wounds that he incurred during World War II. And so remember how they discovered it, right? Shiori goes to the archive and she discovers the can of film that contains the memory of Kyoko, who had died. I think it was 5 years prior. The person in charge at the time of Kyoko's memory, if we recall, is Nakamura-san, the elderly gentleman who's now in charge of the entire department, if you will. There seems to be something quite oddly intrusive about how they can very easily obtain the memory of someone else and watch the memory and watch the videotape and all this stuff. There are all these details that I think are quite interesting, and even the viewpoints and the approaches of these particular officers, if you will, or people in charge, is very different. Mochizuki and Kawashima. Kawashima is the man who has the daughter, and he has a picture of his daughter Sakura, and he's also dealing with 8 of the people, right? And Mochizuki is the gentleman here who's pictured on the front cover of this Blu-ray, of course. So they seem to have a kind of personal way with these a certain number of these stories, and in particular with Mochizuki, with the Mr. Watanabe on the one hand, and then Kawashima-san, he has a particular relationship with the elderly lady, Miss Nishimura, who seems to be, it seems to be that she has, she is remembering herself as what they call a young girl now. I think a girl a young girl, right? And so she doesn't speak very outwardly as much. She speaks a little bit, but that's pretty much it. And so the way that Kawashima-san tries to connect with her is by showing the picture of his daughter. and showing her how much he loves his daughter. And so that's a kind of personal way in which they're trying to get at a connection between these people, perhaps. Sugie, the other man who is one of the three people in charge, he has a kind of different approach, doesn't he? You know, he sometimes very gently berates some of the others for, you know, you can't be too personal about this. This is a job, remember? And also, we don't get any details about his life, really. I mean, I think the only personal detail that we get that is kind of significance is he likes Earl Grey tea. And he seems to recount a story about how he changed his name a lot when he was alive in order to evade the loan sharks from collecting or something like that. But that, he then says, is a lie. That was made up or something like that. And that's when he's talking to the woman with the huge flower on her blouse, and she's talking about you know, the men that she was having affairs with, and her difficulty and meeting, having one of her liaisons or one of her meetings, encounters with someone at the Imperial Hotel, and how the timing or the it wasn't quite off, and she was off by about 4 years, right? So she seems to have lied about her age, right? And that's revealed. And so he then shares this story about how he was trying to run away from the people who were trying to collect, and so. But that, then he says, is a lie. So the whole point is that Sugie, we don't get any details about his life. But it's an interesting concept too, right? What is the most humane way towards approaching these people with their memories? You know, Mochizuki in particular, the main character, seems to have a very sincere or earnest approach towards everyone that he is trying to encounter with. Sugie, on the other hand, has a very maybe business-like or matter-of-fact approach. And I think this is this is exemplified in how they talk about Yamamoto, who is the man with the glasses, who is slightly balding, and he is the sort of the businessman type who has a very dark personality in terms of, you know, I don't want to think about what I've done in the past, or if I choose one memory from my childhood, that means I can forget about everything else. That is truly heaven indeed. And they describe it how he ended up choosing a memory when he was very, very young, and he was hiding away in a little hideaway space, and it was all dark, and so it was the darkness that he chose. And that's a very interesting moment, because Mochizuki approaches it as a kind of human moment, trying to understand what it was about that moment, or what it was that was so difficult about the rest of his life that made him want to choose that particular moment. So it's a very humane way of approaching it on the one hand. Look at Sugie's response. His response is, "Oh, that's very interesting. You know, we can focus in on the sound of this." And so he's talking about it from purely technical aspects. And so that seems to be those seem to be two very different philosophical approaches to this job. And I would argue, or perhaps I see that either approach has its good points and bad points, I would say, in terms of how to deal with the sensitivity or the potential sensitivity of these memory choosings, you know. And so this whole system, I think, is filled with a lot of ambiguity and a lot of inherent inconsistency, which I think make for some really interesting conversation. That's not to say that this is a bad place, but I think those inconsistencies make for potential sources of discussion. Here's another example, and I'll leave it at that. But another example is the young girl, Kana-chan. So she is the young, maybe she's a young high school student. I'm not quite sure. Maybe I'm not sure, but she's a very young girl, right? And we see her. It's on Tuesday, I think, talking to Mochizuki. And Shiori is there, and she's talking about, she wanted to have pancakes, what in Japanese you call hot cake. And so pancakes, and they had good pancakes at Disneyland, and so she was talking about Disneyland. And then immediately after that, if you recall, Shiori, the young girl, goes to Kana-chan, and she says, so you talked about Disneyland and stuff, and then Shiori very gently, but also very directly says, I've been here for some time, and you are the 30th person to have chosen Disneyland as her memory. So this is a very interesting thing too, because this goes to a kind of a question about the rules of this place. To what extent are the people in charge allowed to assert themselves or assert their opinions on these people? It seems to me that they take a very passive approach. In other words, they don't necessarily assert anything, but they merely listen and they allow for the participant to make the decision. Well, here, Shiori kind of does a sort of assertive thing whereby she indirectly, mind you, but still in a very assertive way, tries to, at least the implication is that she is trying to show that perhaps the picking of the Disneyland as a moment, as a memory, is maybe not the best use of this particular opportunity that has presented itself to her. And so that is, I think, a very good thing on the one hand, because ultimately Kana-chan, the young high school student, ends up choosing a memory about how she was lying on the lap of her mother, and she remembers the softness and the warmth of that moment, and it's a very a beautiful moment, and I think one can see that it's something that's personal to her and something that is very important to her, and she ends up thanking Shiori after that, of course. But there's also something to be said about, well, what right did Shiori have to essentially assert herself in Kana-chan's situation? I mean, it really poses some interesting questions about like what is it about the way in which we have to, on the one hand, respect the memories of people, but also on the other hand, try to convince them of certain things that might be of more importance than others. I'm not suggesting that either approach is fine, and I'm not suggesting that what Shiori did was wrong in any way. In fact, I think what she did was the right thing to do. And perhaps there might be some leeway given, especially because I think this young girl, I want to say she's a high school student. Maybe she's an older middle school student. I'm not quite sure. But the reason why I say that is because Shiori, when she talks to her, says, Disneyland is something that is chosen a lot, especially among, for example, middle school students, 中学生とか. And so that suggests that maybe this young girl is either an older middle school student or a younger high school student. I'm not quite sure. I can't quite tell. But in any event, maybe because of her youth, she is young. She seems to be the youngest of the entire group that is here, the youngest of the 22. Maybe that gives some leeway, I don't know, into allowing someone like Shiori to, at least informally anyway, talk to her and maybe give her a little bit of guidance or encouragement about what is more appropriate to choose as a memory to latch on to for eternity, something like that. And in the end, of course, the young girl, Kana-chan, seems to appreciate what Shiori did for her. So there's something to be said about that. But it does bring up an interesting question about sort of the rules and sort of the moral questions that just the existence of this world seems to be posing on many levels. And I think that's what makes this film a really challenging one, an exciting one. So actually, while I'm on the topic, before I go back to the live stream, let me then just continue this on discussion with this idea of the first major point that I brought up in the introduction, which is memory. Okay, so memory, how does memory operate here? And what is it about memory and these people that are participating, and how is it being presented in this film, and why do I think this film does a really stellar job in presenting what it is it presents, and there are certain ambiguities and mysteries that this film brings up about the participants and the memories that they conjure up, and how and there, even at the end, there are some questions that I don't have the answers to, but let's try to talk about that, and then we can go from there. Okay, so There are 22 participants, according to what Nakamura-san says at the very beginning, Monday. This is a film that's set from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then it ends on the following Monday. So Monday, the participants enter, and we get the explanation about what this place is and what they have to do. They have to choose a memory. They have to choose they have to talk it out Monday, Tuesday, and then by Wednesday they have to choose. By Wednesday, the end of Wednesday, they have to choose. And then Thursday, Friday will be devoted to making the memory recreated in film, and then the film will all be assembled for a final kind of farewell ceremony, and then showing the film in a theater on Saturday. And then they will, after they see it, they will experience that memory, and at that moment they will be off to wherever. And then Sunday is where we get the completion of the storyline with Mochizuki. By this time he has decided to also choose a memory, and he indeed chooses a memory, which is then made very quickly, and then it's shown, and then once it's shown in the theater, he is gone, and then that is the film. And then we get to Monday, where we have someone who fills in the shoes of Mochizuki, that of Shiori, and she becomes the new person in charge of that particular situation. And the young man Iseya, who ended up not choosing a memory during that week, he becomes a kind of apprentice to Mr. Kawashima. And so that is the general layout of the film, or process of the film. We have 22 participants who come in, and we see a majority of them in the first day, Monday. And then starting from Tuesday, we start to get their discussions. Not all of them, but some of them. A good number of them, in fact. We start to hear their stories, which then continues on through Wednesday and a little bit on Thursday. But Tuesday and Wednesday are the major days where we hear their talk and discussion, which is very interesting. So let's see. So I made notes here about who these people are, because I think that might be very interesting. So we have Kimiko Tatara, who is the elderly lady who talks about her brother and the dances and the dress that she wore, and the red, the song with the red shoes song. And then we have an elderly lady, Yone Kori, who is talking about meeting her long-lost love on the bridge, from the war. The implication being that maybe he was, right, it had something to do with the war, and maybe he had died, but in fact he wasn't died, so there was a reuniting of the two. And then there is an elderly man who is also seemingly from a soldier from the Japanese war, I'm sorry, World War II, the Japanese army, and he's talking about how he was hungry, and when he was captured, I just asked his captors for a cigarette, and then he asked his captors for boiled rice, and then he asked his captors if he could have some chicken or something like that. And then there's the young girl Kana, who is the middle school or high school girl. And then there's the elderly man who talks about how he was on a cliff and he was about to kill himself, but then something about how the moonlight shone off the rails of a railway or something seemed to snap him out of it. And then there's maybe a woman in her 30s or 40s who is talking about childbirth and labor, and how it's interesting how one forgets that feeling because it's a very intense period, but then after that there is this feeling that she describes about wanting to have children again. And so there's this woman here. There's another man who talks about the moment about reliving the train ride when he was in junior high school, and there's also the elderly man who talks about his sexual escapades in sort of the red light districts of certain areas, and in one place in particular, which is not in Tokyo but in up north, he thinks in Aomori, talks about how there's one particular woman that he was with who was very caring about making porridge and caring for him and all that. But he's talking a lot about his escapades with sex and the like, right? And then there's Mr. Yamamoto, sort of the man who wants to remember only the darkness and nothing. And then there's another young man who talks about the bell of a young woman, that he remembers the bell and it reminds him of her. And he's about to talk about putting on his Converse shoes and tying his shoelaces, but then the film abruptly cuts him off there, and we don't hear from him again. There's another man also named Bundo, who's describing the memory. He remembers when he was a baby, and he remembers the sunlight, and he remembers it was maybe autumn, and he has a feeling it was maybe 3 p.m. or something like that. And then there is the woman with the flower, the huge flower on her blouse, and she's talking about maybe men that she knew in her life, the affairs that she might have had that didn't go well, or she had a lot of disappointments in love, etc., in her love life. And then there's, of course, Mr. Watanabe, the elderly gentleman who's married to Kyoko, and that forms the major storyline with respect to Mochizuki. And then we have Issaya, the young 21-year-old who isn't willing to choose a particular memory because he is insistent. It's very painful for him to look back, according to what he says, and he can't choose a dream. He can't choose a kind of slow motion dream or anything like that. But so he seems to think that it's his way of taking responsibility for something, which is an interesting philosophy that he has. And then there's the elderly woman, Nishimura-san, who he's very interested in collecting things from nature and the petals of flowers, etc. And she very movingly gives a plastic bag filled with the pink petals to Kawashima-san at the very end in Saturday. She tugs at his coat in a very cute way. It's very touching, and just gives him that little bag of flower petals. And so there's that. So by my count, that is 16 people that we see on Monday. 16 people. There is a 17th person that we see, I think, later on in the film. I want to say on Wednesday. I think his name is Kojima-san, or Mr. Kojima, and he's the gentleman who talks about the airplane, the Cessna, and riding in the airplane and stuff. We don't see him at the very beginning in Monday, surprisingly. We only see him for the first time later, from Wednesday on, which is a very interesting thing. And in fact, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's the people that we see on screen talking. By my count, 17 people. We are told that there are 22 people, but then we only see 17 people in these sort of one-on-one interviews. Then there are 5 people that aren't accounted for. At the end of the film, on Saturday, when all the people assemble in the theater, there's a shot of all of them sitting in the theater. We can see that all of them assemble before the lights go down, and then the film is shot. We don't see the final film, by the way, which is an interesting detail. We only see the little logo that's shot on the screen that it cuts to sometime later. But we see the people assemble in the theater. If you look closely, there are some people that are in the theater that we've never seen in the film before. Now, I've counted, by my count, there are 5 people in that theater that we haven't seen, which is interesting. There's a kind of elderly man at the first row that we've never seen. There's another woman, maybe on the right-hand part of the screen, that we haven't seen. There's a gentleman or a young man in the middle who's wearing a blue jumpsuit or something. That's also very interesting. There's a woman next to Yamamoto-san who we've never seen before, and then there's another person in the upper right part of the screen. So by my count, there are 5 people there. So there are 5 unknown figures that we've never met in that final theater scene on Saturday. So that is probably that accounts for the fact that we see 17 people talking on screen, and then the remaining 5, for whatever reason, we never saw any part of. We just saw their face or them sitting in the theater at the very end. And a very interesting detail, we don't see the man who's talking about the Cessna plane. If you look closely in that Saturday theater, if you freeze frame it, I mean, I've done it many times. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure we don't see the guy who is talking about the airplane, which is an interesting detail. We don't see him on Monday, and we don't see him on Saturday for whatever reason. But he's still counted in the final tally of 22 people. So, this is the cast of characters, if you will, of the stories that we have, and just as a matter of filmmaking and how Koreeda and the filmmakers and editors put this film together, and how the flow is really quite remarkably smooth. There are some details that I just want to bring to your attention that I think are quite extraordinary. I'm sorry, I forgot another person. There's an elderly woman who on Monday, we see her talking on Tuesday. I forgot about this, but she's talking about how she was, I think, 9 years old, and she was experiencing the Great Kanto earthquake. And she was remembering she had to evacuate to the bamboo forest, and she remembers the rice balls or something like that. And so that is also very important. So she is another participant in this. So she is part of the 16 people that we see on Monday. And we see some glimpse of her somewhat throughout the rest of the week, of course. But, excuse me, so... so as a kind of filmmaking technique of how Koreeda balances these stories together, because there are many threads that are trying to be sewn or threaded throughout, and it might seem to be somewhat of a challenge to try to keep everything in balance, but there are some neat little tricks that are done to link some of them together almost subliminally. So for example, the older woman who was talking on Tuesday about the Kanto earthquake and how she was young, and she says, "wasurerarimasen," which means I will never forget. It's something that you can never forget, and she talks about that. She says there's something you can never forget, and then that cuts to the story from the woman who is talking about giving birth and going into labor, and she says, it's remarkable how one forgets these moments. That's a little interesting thing. So Koreeda connects that moment with this concept of forgetting. On the one hand, going from a woman who's talking about it's impossible to forget, to another story of another woman saying, "Oh yeah, it's amazing how one forgets these things." That's a little subliminal link that is a very nice thing. And then the same is true for the the elderly man who was a soldier, and he's talking about he got captured, and he's like, "Give me a cigarette, please," or "Give me boiled rice, please." And he says, "Oh, he saw a chicken." He said, "Oh, I'd love to eat I'd love to eat some of the poultry or something." And then it cuts to the young girl, Kana-chan, talking about she wanted to eat pancakes, right? And then she going to Disneyland. And so there's a little subliminal link there too about eating, right? And wanting to eat something. Right? For the soldier, it was boiled rice, and then it was the chicken. And then it cuts to Kana-chan, the young girl, and talking about wanting to eat the delicious pancakes, from Disneyland. And so there's another little subliminal link that is quite interesting too. There's another interesting one that I always find very charming. I never caught it until much, much later in my life. But there's the young man. We never see him. We only see him once or maybe twice at most. We don't see him ever again until the very end of the film when they're all gathering in the theater. But we see a little bit of what he's talking about. He has a little twitch when he speaks. In his face, you can tell he does have a little bit of a twitch, and I'm not sure what that is. But when he's talking about the bell, and he's talking about how there's a girl that he knew that had a little bell that was attached, and whenever he heard the bell, it was a lovely sound. It reminded him of that memory, and he was talking about the Converse shoes. And that's an interesting moment, because it seems to me that the memory that he's latching onto is the idea of the bell, and the sound of the bell, and how that was very significant to him. Well, he's in the theater at the very end on Saturday. He's, I think, in one of the upper rows, maybe on the left-hand side of the screen. And when you when everyone gathers and the lights go down, just before they do, there's a little announcement which is made in the form of a bell ringing. Ding, 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 ding. And notice how people react. Everyone's pretty much looking straight ahead at the screen or whatever, at the camera. Only he kind of turns his head up and he kind of notices, oh, something happens. That is such an interesting detail. I don't know if it was done on purpose, but it seems to be like we could look at that moment as being like, oh, maybe he is remembering the bell sound. He hears the bell sound that makes him recall that memory that he had. I think that's such a lovely moment. And even if it weren't on purpose, I think it's such a lovely detail. That's another little link that I think is an example of how well or how fluidly or how subtly this film links things together in a very great way, in a way that seems very smooth and subliminal. They're almost invisible, but they are quite there, and I think there's a certain purpose to most of them anyway. Then, if we can go to that idea of the bell and the sound, I think one of the things that this film also focuses on very, very well in terms of how we approach memory, how some of us approach memory anyway, is this idea of tactile feelings and sensations, memories that we experience via sensations, or how sensations seem to be an integral part of what it is we remember. So the example that I just cited is this idea of the sound of the bell. That is a very specific detail that is very important. Another example is maybe the man who was on the train, remembering when he was in junior high school and riding the train, the front of the train, and they had to get the sound of the tracks just right. There's that little detail. Or the idea of the wings of the Cessna. They have to be of a certain type, right, to be just right, and that sort of, and also the notion of being in a cloud when you're flying and that sort of thing. Even when the workers here, Mochizuki and Kawashima and Sugie and Nakamura and others, they're talking. I think they're talking at the end of Tuesday night, and they're talking about the kind of problem cases, right? They're talking about 4 of the problem cases, at least what we see on screen, and they're talking about how one particular person, Bundo, how can he remember being a baby? How is that possible? And then that leads them to a conversation about what was it that they first remembered. And Suge talks about the little pass that he wore as a little kid, and some light glinting off of it. And so there's this idea of light and shining of some sort. And then Kawashima talks about the tea, the hojicha that and there's something about how his tongue was remembering the taste or the sensation, the heat or the hotness of the tea. And then there's Mochizuki, who's talking about visiting his relatives up north somewhere, and talking about the snow and the snowfall, and remembering that moment. And so these are kind of things that are very tactile, and they're based on the senses and sensations. And so this film also deals, I think, quite deftly with this idea of how memory and how we look at memory is part and parcel based on sensations. And that's very true, right? Because sometimes we go through life and a certain sensation that we might experience or taste or feel or sense will make us recall something that we experienced in our past, or something that is now a memory to us. And so I really appreciate that discussion that the film leads us into. It goes also into, is it really possible to remember being a baby? What is our earliest memory? What happens to those memories that we had of experiences that we definitely lived but we don't remember now? What is it about the nature of remembering things from our youth, which is different from remembering things later in our life, etc. And that's the sort of thing that I think is 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 very on point in the discussion of memory and how we recall certain things from feeling things and from touching things and from sensing things and smelling things. I mean the way in which the young girl talks about her mother, it's she says, you know, being with her mother and lying down, you know, the softness of it and the warmth of it, you know, that sort of thing. And then when she talks to Shiori later, Shiori talks about how she remembers sort of things or feelings or moments about maybe her father, you know, how broad his shoulders were, or kind of the sweaty smell, or the way that he had a certain kind of pomade in his hair, or that sort of thing. And so these are the sort of things that I really love about this. It's just the way in which this film deals with a sort of the tactile nature of memory, and how that sensations are and feelings and touches and smells and tastes and the like, those are very key in layering or connecting with something that is part of our memory, part of who we are. And so I really appreciate that about this particular film. Oh gosh, let's see. Well, let me stop there, and then I will continue this. But first, let me just go to the live chat, and then we can go from there. So, let's see. Okay, Carl's Rants and Reviews is here. I'm going to order this movie when I can. Yes, I strongly recommend it if you can. JR62 says, it feels kind of bleak and profound. I have never contemplated memory. Yeah, so if you haven't seen the film, I would strongly recommend. I wouldn't necessarily call it bleak. I think it's not wholly dark. I think it's very emotional and very rewarding that way. I wouldn't necessarily call it bleak, but it does rely, I think, potentially so anyway, on a kind of subjective experience. And so it does make one think of one's own life, if that makes any sense. And so there's a lot of potential reward in that. There's also a lot of maybe some inherent pain in that as well. It really depends on one's own subjective experience, of course. But I think there's a lot of potential for kind of self-discovery or self-reflection, if you will. A really great opportunity because it's a great film. L.A. Cohen says, I have the wonderful BFI Blu-ray set featuring this film. Yes, the BFI set is one way of getting this. Great. Okay, just skipping down here. Let's see. Alan says, I find that in a movie where the focus of the film is personal memory of one's own life, that it is the memory of another that resolves the inability to move on of one of the main characters. Yes, I think if I'm not mistaken, maybe you're referring specifically to the Mochizuki character and how he is a worker here because he wasn't able to choose a memory when he was in that same situation, right? And then it's when he sees the memory that Watanabe chooses of him as an elderly man sitting on the bench in Chuo Park in Ginza with his wife Kyoko, and how he sees that, and he knows that Kyoko was his love that he lost because he died, right? And so that then leads to Mochizuki being able to choose his own memory, which is actually quite different. It's not of Kyoko at all, which is very interesting, of course. It's in fact of him sitting in the set and then looking up and then seeing the film crew and the people who he's been working with here for, I think it's 3 years, I think. So this is a very interesting way in which the Mochizuki storyline resolves itself. So I agree with you, Alan, 100%. Glowing to Hobbit says, I think we all enter the computer like the movie The Matrix when we die. Yeah, it's possible. Yes, that could be it. Zyrother says, the most profound aspect for me was that many of their happiest memories occurred during times of violence and strife. Yes, this is a very good point. Thank you very much for reminding me. This is this film has often been described as being kind of like what you say, Zyrother, maybe violence and strife. You maybe like World War II, as an example, even earlier, the Great Kanto earthquake, 1923, and other events like that, and the World War II in particular features in a lot of these stories, but not just that, but there are also many traumatic or very problematic events in people's lives that are very personal and very intimate. There's the elderly man. I don't think his name is mentioned by name, but you can see his name is Takahashi, I think. And he's talking about how he was about to commit suicide when he was 20. He was on a cliff. So that's a very dark moment as well. And there's also Yamamoto, and he's, we're not quite sure what his story is, but the implication is that he is very despondent for some reason that we never discover, of course. So there are moments like that. I would say it seems like, on the one hand, that and I've read this somewhere. It's not my idea, but I have read this somewhere, that this Koreeda was trying to get to kind of a sort of a view on the history of Japan, or the modern history of Japan, starting from these very historic events, and just going from there. And then, therefore, we see more or less a kind of variety among the people who are participating in this, for the most part anyway. And different modes of that, sort of the economic boom, post-war economic miracle of Japan, as it were, and the idea of the salaryman, and the salaryman life that came in the post-war boom, and the war, of course, and going even further back to even before the war, etc. So there is a kind of arc, if you will, of Japanese history that seems to be at play in the sort of selection of memories that or the selection of stories that we seem to be sharing in, which I think is very interesting. I mean, I would say also that, maybe a good number of them are therefore memories that are being chosen out of violence, or in the context of violence, or the background, against the background of some kind of violence or strife or some kind of crisis, etc. But then there are others that aren't necessarily, right? The dance hall, and the elderly woman in the dance halls and dancing as a young girl with her dress, or the man flying in the airplane, or maybe the sound of the bell, if that was the memory that he indeed chose, and the high school kid, and remembering her mother, and those sorts of memories. I think those are not necessarily ones of strife necessarily, but quite the opposite. So there's a good mix, I would say, very much. But that there are the share that are definitely ones that are taking place against the background of some kind of crisis event, or some critical event. That's for sure. That's definitely for sure. And I do want to say something about memory before I go on, which is this idea that, the way in which memory is discussed, I was trying to suggest there's sort of a positive, assertive nature about it, in that people are asked to choose a memory and choose something that is a kind of positive event, that is something that can then be on the basis of a recreation in cinema. Well, there are some moments here where the negative aspect of remembering or not remembering is also something that is very important to a lot of people, which is an interesting concept about memory. There's something about trying to remember things. There's something about remembering things that didn't happen. That's also an interesting little detail. There's also the idea of remembering something that is, in a sense, darkness, but doing so means you're forgetting other things as well. That's another kind of interesting way of looking back on one's life. What are some examples of this? So, as I was trying to allude to it in my introductory comments, so Isaya, the young 21-year-old who refuses to choose a memory, he seems to be asserting a number of reasons why. And I'm not sure if those are genuine reasons of his, or maybe what he says later, he feels like maybe there's a certain responsibility for not choosing. He also asserts sometime earlier that it's very difficult for him. He doesn't want to look back on his life. He just wants to think about other things. And so there's this idea of maybe looking back is just too painful. And what is it about? I mean, why do we have to choose a memory? I mean, why can't we choose what young Isaiah was trying to suggest, which is, oh, can I choose a dream? It's always cool to think about being in slow motion or something. Like, can't I choose a dream? For whatever reason, he can't. And so there's an interesting detail about that, by the way. Off-screen, Kawashima, who is the person that is in charge, he says, "You mean dreams that you have while sleeping?" He asked that question, which I think is a very interesting detail, because that would suggest that there's this idea of dreams that we have when we are sleeping, and then dreams that we have when we are not sleeping. And it's the idea that maybe the latter are the kinds of dreams that we can voluntarily conjure up, or maybe we can actively construct based on our own likes and our own desires. Whereas dreams that we have while we're sleeping tend to be more based not necessarily on a kind of voluntary, something that we want to experience, but things that are subconsciously conjured up, that are maybe beyond our direct control, as it were. And so I love that distinction that one question from Kawashima-san makes. It really it's almost a throwaway line, but it's actually quite profound. So I really appreciate that. But going back to Isaiah-kun, or the young Isaiah, he doesn't choose, right? And so it's almost like that act of not choosing is itself a statement. That seems to be what his final stance is. And if that's the case, that is also a way of kind of asserting one's existence, right? Making a statement, right, about not choosing a memory. And so that brings a great question as to the function of memory and showing one's existence, sort of the existential necessity of memory, to put it one way. For some people, perhaps it's very important, but yet for others, it's not important at all. And I would suggest maybe that's the case for Isaiah, and maybe these other people in here. Maybe for other people, it's the fact that they cannot choose. They're like Watanabe, the elderly Watanabe. They are really unable to choose. But maybe some are like Isaiah. They refuse to choose. And if that's the case, then that is also a kind of existential statement that I think is just as powerful. It's quite different than choosing a memory, of course, but it's just as powerful and just as potent and just as legitimate, I would suggest. So there is something to be said about kind of an alternative approach to memory, which I think Isaiah-kun gives us in a very direct and quite believable way. Also, talking about the negative approach, there's a wonderful detail. Actually, before I go to that, also I would just bring back the comments that I made about Yamamoto, the sort of businessman who just remembers the darkness when he was a little boy, I think 5 years old, and so it's sort of a negative image, or it's not even something that's an active, proactive thing, but it's just a negative image, the darkness that he chooses. And so that's an interesting moment as well, because that is, it's not something that is an image, but it's the antithesis of an image. It's nothing. And so that too becomes a kind of memory in a very interesting way. We don't know what kinds of sounds were there. Maybe sounds were employed. Maybe they weren't employed. We don't know, because we never see the final product of the filmed memory, or the memory recreated on film. But if we can, it's really interesting to ponder and to kind of imagine what that ultimate final film looked like. I mean, was it just a final black screen that had no sound? If that's the case, then that's quite an interesting way to go. And if that's something that you'll have for you for eternity, this black screen, what does that say? Is that, and the fact that he claims that this moment is heaven, because it means that you are forgetting other things. right? That is the very nature of a kind of negative approach to memory, having nothing which negates everything else, and that being the mode of happiness that obviously provides to him, we think. So you'd think that that kind of moment of darkness would be a kind of nihilistic approach to memory, at least from his subjective viewpoint. But in fact, it's quite the opposite, at least based on what we hear about him. And so that's a very interesting thing about how the negative nature of remembrance can be to one's benefit. And it's not necessarily that the negative nature of memory automatically equals a nihilistic approach. And I really appreciate that about this film. There's also another detail that I really love, which is a kind of the way in which people remember things that didn't happen, that are just as important as remember things that did happen. So that also goes into this idea of positive things and then the negative things, things that happened and things that didn't happen. The woman who had the flower on her blouse, and she's talking about certain men in her life and the relationships that apparently didn't go as well as she would have liked. There is. I should point out, I've read somewhere that there is kind of the implication based on her dialogue that maybe this woman was a prostitute by nature, and it's not clear. It's only clear in the Japanese dialogue. To be perfectly honest, I don't see it myself. I've heard the dialogue many times, but I don't hear anything in what she says that would suggest to me that she was a prostitute. It could have been, but I don't see it. I see her story more as being stories of one or more men in her life that disappointed her for whatever reason. Either they were married, and they couldn't marry her back, or maybe they didn't meet for a particular liaison that was planned, or something like that. So she was talking about disappointments with the men in her life, or a man in her life, whatever the case may be. That also is not clear. Sugie, the person who's in charge of her case, if you recall, asks, do you remember what you talked to him about? Do you remember what you talked to him about, talking about this particular man? Remember what she says in return. This is really fascinating. She says, she thinks about it for a moment, and she says, he never said, I love you. That is such a great detail, I think, because Sugie explicitly asks her, "What do you remember? What you and he talked about?" So what's being implied there is that she should answer, "We talked about X. We talked about Y. We talked about Z." These are sort of positive things that she would provide the answer to. No, the first thing that she says as a response is, "He never said I love you," which I think is such a small detail, almost throwaway, but it's so poignant and very powerful and very significant, because that also shows this idea of memory, remembering things that didn't happen, which is potentially just as profound as remembering things that did happen. And I think that is a really great, a deep statement. And that's true also. I mean, I think back about things in my life and things that didn't happen, for instance, things that I wanted to happen but never materialized for whatever reason, or things that I was expecting but it never happened, and or certain things of that similar nature. And so that I realized about that it's just as poignant and powerful to remember things that didn't happen as it is remembering things that did happen. And so I think that balance, it comes out. And of course, how important that is, it really depends on the subjective experience and us, right? And me for me, and you for you, etc. So I think that little detail with the woman in the flower, I think it is almost a throwaway moment, because it just goes by very quickly, but it's very significant in this idea of memory being both positive and negative, and either way, it's still very significant and important, because ultimately and fundamentally, it all comes down all the way back to one's subjective experience. Okay, so let's see. Now it's now 12:30. Wow, I've gone on for a long time. I apologize. So let me now just stop and take a quick moment to go to the live chat. Let's see. All you lucky people says here. So thanks for the live stream. I imported the Japanese Blu-ray of Afterlife that you're featuring on your desk there almost 2 years ago, June 2018. Very good. Thank you very much. Yes. So this is the Blu-ray. Let me just talk about this while I can. This is the Blu-ray of Afterlife. The title is Wonderful Life. I think it's still available. You can get it, for instance, through Amazon Japan, I think. Retail price, it's Japanese Blu-rays retail tend to be quite expensive anyway. I mean, they tend to be kind of, they're not, this isn't packed with a lot of things. There are only 2 supplements of kind of significance. There's a kind of a short videotaped discussion between the actors who played Iseya and the actor who played Mochizuki. His name is Arata, and the director, Koreeda. So the 3 of them are talking in a kind of a room somewhere, and then the rest of it's very short, and then there's another topic of each of the actors being interviewed for a little bit, and that's basically it, and they just go and share their memories about the film quite after the fact. I think this video was shot rather maybe a few years ago, so it wasn't simultaneous to the filming of the film. And then there's another supplement which I think is like maybe a longer, slightly maybe 20-30 minute program that probably was shown on TV. Don't quote me on that, but it feels like it was. It was kind of a documentary that features, I think, 4 of the actors and what they did, what they're doing now, a little bit about their lives after the filming of Afterlife. And so you have the actor who played Mochizuki's there, Nakamura, the Kanite, Tanike, excuse me, who played Nakamura, is there. Arata, who's also known as Arata Ira, who plays Mochizuki, he's there. The Terajima, Susumu Terajima, who plays Kawashima, he's featured at the end. There's also Eric Oda, who plays Shiori. We see her in her apartment or something, and we hear what these actors are doing now, or what they were doing at the time of making that little documentary. And so it's not really connected directly to the making of Afterlife, and so there's nothing, and it's not subtitled in English too. Although the supplements are not subtitled in English. It's still worth it, I think, to have this Blu-ray. I think it's really great. It's great quality, of course, and it's nice to have this film on Blu-ray. The features aren't that overwhelming. They're quite good for what they are, but they're not like super packed like like a digipack Criterion, for instance. And I don't have the BFI set, and so I can't compare it, but I have this, and so the film has also been available on a North American DVD that's now out of print and quite old, and so I used to have that as well. So which I still do, in fact, somewhere, I think. But oh gosh, what is it? So is it worth getting this Blu-ray? It's kind of tough to answer that question. It is kind of expensive if you're ordering it from outside of Japan, if you consider not only the retail price, but also potential shipping costs. And so it might be a little bit expensive, but if you are really into this film, this is definitely worth having, and so definitely consider it. I would certainly consider it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it completely to anyone who would have to ship it from outside of Japan, or to ship it to somewhere outside of Japan, but it's definitely worth considering, especially if there are no other options available to you immediately in terms of having this film at the ready. So, but yeah, it's a good one to have, and so it's great. And yes, the Japanese Blu-ray does have English subtitles as far as the film is concerned, not the supplements, but as far as the film is concerned. Okay. Paul Emery, yes. Yes, thank you very much, Paul Emery. Thank you for, I got your post. Great. The DVD from, is it Thailand, you said? So hopefully that was a good quality. I hope you enjoyed it. Wolfgrat says, I took the opportunity for a third watch since last week's discussion. Thank you very much. And yep, it is now near the top of my Core Ada list. So a week well spent. That makes me very, very happy, Wolfgrat. I am so happy to read that. Lovely, lovely. Yeah, it turned out great in the end, right? Having that extra week. And all you lucky people adds, for anyone who may not know, the Japanese Blu-ray is Region 1, or Region, what is it? Region, is it A, I think it's called? Gosh, I always forget these things. Yeah, whatever it is. I think was it A? Blu-ray regions are A, B, C, I think so. DVDs are 1, 2, 3. So the Blu-ray is region A. It's Japan and the US have the same Blu-ray region. So yes, so you should be able to watch it if you're on a US player without necessarily needing a region-free player or something like that. So yes, yes. Gloin the Hobbit says, Daisuke, who is your favorite dead person? Dead? Oh, you mean the among the participants who were deceased in the film, right? Who is your favorite? You mean in terms of story? Oh gosh, and you say my favorite was the dancer old lady. She was really lovely, I think. Well, before I answer your question, your comment reminds me about one thing that I should say. About, well, actually, let me save that for the second part of the discussion. So let's see here. I think gosh, that's hard to say. There are so many ones that I really like her, yet Tatara Kimiko, the elderly lady who talks about the dancing. I think she has a really great story. Oh gosh, I do like the one about. There's something very charming about the gentleman who's remembering about the train, and his riding on the train, and the way he describes it. You know, he has this really lovely way, this kind of. There's this way that he speaks, and this is more relevant to the second part of my discussion, but. Let me bring it up now, actually, which is this idea that the elderly gentleman, he's not elderly, he's the gentleman who's talking about how his memory, a great moment in his life when he was young, and he was riding the train. He was in the front of the train, and he was riding the train, and he felt the wind and stuff like that, and says, what a great experience. I love that story for many reasons, but one of the reasons why I love that story and that person is because he describes it in such a way that's so telling about this film. You know, I was talking about truth and fiction and lies and not necessarily saying the truth. Well, that is something that comes out in this film on a very macro level, a very broad macro level, which I'll try to get to in a moment, but also comes out in a very micro, very minute way in many ways. In particular, and for example, it comes out in how some of the people and the participants just speak and they talk when they're being asked these questions. And it's very inherent also in how the Japanese language operates in this particular situation of being interviewed. And a case in point is with this gentleman and talking about the train. Remember what he says. I think it's Tuesday. He's asked, and he's, I think, the first person to be talking on Tuesday. And he's talking about, okay, he has to remember something. He says, I had a very ordinary life, right? And I'm paraphrasing here. He says, I had a very ordinary life, but... yeah, and then he leads to his memory. But remember what he said is very similar. I can't be specific. That's what he says first. I can't be specific. He says, "Tokutei dekinai keredomo." I can't be specific, but, and then he goes into a story, and he's actually very specific, right? And he says, "Oh yeah, I can't be specific, but it was the second year of my junior high school year, the day before." summer vacation or something. He's very specific. And I think that's such a lovely moment because I think unintentionally, because I think he's one of the participants that is not a professional actor, okay? And assuming that this, therefore, is a kind of real memory, which I'm not sure if we can go that far, but I think we can say that this is probably some kind of recollection that is at least reliant in some way on some kind of real truth of some kind. Okay, but assuming that's the case, the fact that he's speaking like this is so charming, and it's so indicative of Japanese language. You know, there's a way that some people in Japanese have to speak. There's a certain kind of unspoken rule of not being immediately forthcoming with information. So we have to sort of be, what's the phrase, self-effacing, and not necessarily showing what it is we are saying immediately. So that's I think the reason why he says at the very start, you know, I can't be specific. I don't really know. I can't. I don't remember specifically about it. And then when he starts to get into it, that's when he gets the details. So that's a very almost Japanese language or linguistic way in which information is being presented. And so I really love that as a kind of reflection of a societal aspect of Japanese language usage, because then after he says, you know, I don't really know, I can't be specific, but it was actually, yeah, the second year of my junior high school, just the day before summer vacation started. I remember that. I think that's such a charming moment. Also, it does go into this idea on a micro level of truth and fiction, right? Because when he says, I don't really know, that is, I think, on its face anyway, a kind of fiction. When he says, I don't remember, and then he says he remembers specifically what happens, that little moment at the beginning of that speech is itself a kind of, it's not a lie necessarily, but it's a kind of not necessarily a whole truth, let me put it that way. And so that is a kind of fiction that inaugurates this whole story about him riding the train, which is a very interesting way of presenting the memory that he's, or presenting the story that he's saying, right? Because he is using a kind of lie as a kind of linguistic device to then go into the discussion of the train. And so therefore, that is a kind of maybe that is a kind of basis upon which I would say that this film is maybe as its hypothesis or its thesis, positing that a lie, even how small it is, a small lie is not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, it might be the result of some kind of societal expectation. Here may be the societal expectation about how to use Japanese in this particular situation. Or it could be just a way of self-effacement, and which is also a reflection of one's position in society, also one's personality, perhaps, who knows. So there is something quite personal and quite direct about that lie that he begins his tale with. And I think, therefore, that gives us more indication about who he is, or who he might be as a person. And therefore, the lie is just as important as the truth, as it were. And I find that to be very, very charming about that particular story. The similar thing is happening also with the elderly lady and the dance hall things that she's talking about. When she talks about her brother, right? She talks about her brother and how he passed away earlier, and how she really cared for him, and she and her brother were close. And so when she recalls her brother and he passed, and when she recalls those details when she's asked about them, look at her face. Her face is almost like red. It's almost frozen in the way it's registering a kind of smile on her face. It's not a smile of happiness, though. That is a smile on the look on her face it's a smile even when she's talking about something that's very difficult in her life, the death of her brother, right? And I think that's also very significant. That's something very similar to the gentleman in the train, which is that the smile is almost like it's not a lie. Right? That is, she's not lying through her face and her visage, but it's almost like she she can't, or maybe it's a kind of social etiquette to not show any kind of sadness or register any kind of sadness or a morose look on one's face, even when one is recounting something in one's life that is very sad or very despondent. So that also is a kind of interesting interplay, especially in the context of truth and fiction. What is truth? What is fiction? Here, maybe the facial expression is not what she is actually feeling, but it is still a kind of reflection of her as a person, because maybe she is doing it to protect herself, or maybe she is doing it as a means of politeness or of etiquette or something similar along those lines. In any event, what we see on her face doesn't necessarily, or maybe it does, I'm not sure, link to what it is that she's talking about, which is the death of her brother. And so there's an interesting divide, which also I think ties in very nicely with this idea of truth and fiction, the idea of what is real, what is not real, what is fake and what is not fake. But even if something is fake, like her expression on her face is fake, that is still not a bad thing, right? It's still very illustrative of what it is who she is as a person, or what she went through, or maybe something that she doesn't want to show us, right? And that goes back also to a discussion about memory. You know, sometimes there are things about memory that we don't necessarily want to show. We don't necessarily want to express to everyone. That's what Isaya-kun, the young man, was talking about, how he didn't want to choose anything. And I think there's something about that moment with the elderly woman and the look on her face. That's almost like, that is what Isiya-san, the young man Isiya, was talking about, you know, something that's so painful you don't really want to show it. I mean, she's talking about it, but she doesn't really show it on her face. And so I think that's such a great moment. And it links so nicely also to what, as I say, what Isiya, the young man, was talking about in with respect to memory. So that is so great. But then let's take a step back here and think about what it is that this film is dealing with as far as truth and let's call it non-truth. And I kind of alluded to it earlier, but let's see if we can expand on this a little bit, which is that if we think about the actors in this film, some of the actors are indeed actors. I mean, it's very clear that they are actors. So let's focus on the participants. And we know that they're actors because they are very famous. In fact, you look at them and you can recognize them as being actors, or not necessarily very famous, but they have appeared in other films. Like the young girl who is the high school student. You know, she's appeared in other films, Koreeda films, in fact, and so she's an actor. So her story is she's not a real high school student. The man who plays Yamamoto is an actor. So his story isn't real. I also understand, my own understanding also is that the woman who played with the flower on her blouse, she's an actress. The man, the elderly man who talks about sex all the time, he's an actor. Let's see. Watanabe, the elderly man, and his wife, when he's talking about his wife Kyoko and Mochizuki, Watanabe, he's an actor as well. And so there are all these, and also the elderly woman, Nishimura-san, who she picks up the flower petals and that, she's an actress as well. And so her story isn't real. Isiya, the young man Isiya, who refuses to choose a memory, he's an actor as well. So a number of these participants are actors, and they're not the characters that they are portraying. Although there are some interesting interplays with it. For instance, the actor who plays Isiya, his actual screen name, or the name that he uses as an actor anyway, is in fact Isiya. So the names are the same. So there's an interesting kind of overlapping even within the actor group here. So that adds an interesting little dimension as well. And just because they are actors doesn't automatically mean that what they are talking about is automatically fiction. Now that adds a little wrinkle, which I think is very interesting. So, for example, just because I can only speculate and ponder what the possibilities might be. But let's go to the young woman, the high school student, Kana-chan. So she's an actor. So she's not. That's not a real high school student, right? But that's just a character in the film. But what of this moment that she describes about her mother and being with her mother, and the warmth of lying on her mother's lap, and is that something that was scripted or made up? So was it scripted and made up, or was it something that maybe she borrowed from her own memory? I don't really know. It's interesting to speculate. Something similar happens too with, remember, I described it earlier with the sort of the meeting at the end of Tuesday when Mochizuki, and they're at night, they're all talking about the problem cases, and then they're asking, what was your earliest memory? And they each recount something. And Mochizuki-san, or Mochizuki in particular, he talks about the snow and that snow feeling, or Kawashima talks about drinking the tea and that sort of thing. Who is to say that these memories aren't? These are all actors, right? But who is to say that these might not necessarily be things? They might not necessarily be scripted. Who knows? Maybe they're things that they borrowed from their real life. I don't know. It's very interesting to speculate about that. Speaking of the people who work there, the one guy that we don't know much about, Sugie, when he's talking to the woman with the flower, and he catches her in a little white lie that she tells about how she's not as young as she claims she is, then he goes into his own story about, I've had many names in my life, this name, that name, and one of the names he lists is in fact Naito. I've been known by many names, Naito. And that's an interesting little thing that he says, because in fact, the actor's name is Takashi Naito. That's his name. And so he uses the name Naito as one of the names that he lists as being, I've been known under many names throughout my life, because I tried to evade the loan sharks or whatever. That's an interesting little detail. It's almost like real life seeped into this moment, even though he is also an actor. And I actually tried to look that up. I was never able to discover it, but I was trying to look up if all the names that he listed before then were maybe names of characters that he had played in other films or other TV works or something. I'm not sure. I was never able to answer that question. It could be, but I'm not sure. I don't think so, but it could be. But there's of course, an extra added wrinkle in that scene, of course, because remember what he says, just kidding, right, at the end of that. So that was all also a lie, and he acknowledges it. But was it really a lie? Who knows? And in fact, we know that at least part of it wasn't a lie, in the sense that his name in real life is indeed Naito. So even in what I'm trying to suggest is, even with the actors, there are moments where we can see that maybe there is room to think that maybe their stories, or part of their stories, are indeed based on truth, even though the very fact that they are actors means that they are operating on a kind of fiction, a lie, right? Actors are liars in that sense, right? They are not necessarily telling the truth in a direct sense, because they are not who they say they are in real life. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but that's one way of looking at that sort of thing. And yet they might be borrowing from certain feelings or certain memories that they own, that they might have, or that might all just be made up. That might all just be part of the whole structure of the film that is constructed on purpose by Koreeda, who is also the director and the writer of this film. And I go back to the story of Mochizuki and the snow, because I think that's very important. Why does he bring up the snow? It's very coincidental that he brings up the story of the snow on Tuesday as being one of the earliest things that he remembers, the earliest memories, right? And then what happens on Saturday? It begins to snow, right? And Saturday is a key moment, because that is the moment when he decides to have a memory, and then he goes with the memory, right? the assumption is he has made his decision, right? Because it's on Saturday that he gets the letter from Watanabe, and Watanabe acknowledges that he realizes that Mochizuki was in fact the old lover of his wife, etc. And so that's an interesting coincidence, right? Snow for his earliest memory, and then snow on the day that he decides to stick with one final memory. So if that's the case, then there's also room to think that maybe in fact the snow memory was in fact not real at all, but in fact just a construction for the purposes of creating a narrative arc in the film, even if it's just a subliminal or just a visual arc of some kind, of course, as well. I mean, that is something that's very interesting. I mean, is that a story ultimately, therefore, a whole lie? If that's the case, that doesn't necessarily sap it of its power and effectiveness, but it just goes to show that even something that is not necessarily a truth still holds a certain degree of power and emotional weight that I think is very important. And this is well, actually, let me I'll wait on that detail in a second. Now let me go to the non-actors here. I would suggest that there is a similar degree of complexity and nuance with the non-actor portion of the participants here as well, right? Because as we can guess, there are some actors here that are professional actors, and then there are some participants who are not professional actors as well. So the elderly woman with the and I'm guessing, of course, but based on what I've tried to look up online and other sources, for instance, the elderly woman talking about the dancing and the red dress and the red shoes, she's probably a non-actor. And other people, maybe the young man who's talking about the bell, maybe he's a non-actor. Maybe the elderly man who's talking about his experiences with the war, maybe he's a non-actor. Maybe the elderly woman who's talking about the earthquake, maybe she's a non-actor. And go on and on. And maybe the man who's talking about the train, maybe he's a non-actor as well. So, and the man who's talking about the airplane and the Cessna, maybe he's a non-actor as well. So there are and the list goes on as well. So there are a group that could be seen as being non-actors, and you can kind of tell as well because the way they present, the way they talk, seems more real than the actors who are performing. I mean, as great as their performances are, don't get me wrong, there is still a kind of noticeable difference, or maybe subtle difference. Not noticeable, but there's a subtle difference, almost imperceptible difference, let me put it that way. But still, there's a kind of feeling that you can get when you watch someone who seems more non-professional than someone who is a professional actor. You can kind of get a sense of that. Although, there are complexities that are brought into this. And let me give you some examples. Okay, so there's one person who there's one person who I thought seemed to be maybe one of the non-professional actors, right? And that was the guy who was who's talking about remembering being a baby, remembering, at birth and stuff. And I thought he was a non-professional. He feels like a non-professional. And in fact, I'm not. Maybe he is an actor in Japanese films and television. I just don't recognize him. So that's a possibility. But he feels like a non-professional on the one hand. But it's curious. It's very curious that, remember at the end of Tuesday, when the group are having their little meeting about the problem cases. So the problem cases that they bring up are the elderly woman, Nishimura, who doesn't seem, maybe she is remembering being 9 years old or being a young girl, and the flowers. And then there's Isia, who's the young man who refuses to choose a memory. And there's Watanabe, the elderly man who's also having trouble figuring out a memory. And then there's the young man who's talking about remembering being a baby, right? So the first three are actors. The fourth, I thought, was non-professional. That's what I thought. But the fact that he's included in the four here, the rest of the three are being professional actors with, let's say, constructed stories, perhaps, might suggest that the fourth is also fictionalized, not real. And the fact also that the story that he recounts, I remember being a baby, is then used in that scene in the meeting. And then everyone's talking about, what was your earliest childhood memory? And then Nakamura, the leader there, saying, it's been proven scientifically that you can remember, that feeling that you get when you are in a hot bath. Maybe it reminds you of being in the womb, so to speak. And then it cuts later to Shiori in the bath, maybe trying to recollect that same feeling or that same, and then she goes into her room, and then there's a smile on her face, which is such a beautiful moment, because it seems to just suggest that maybe she was successful. I'm not sure, but my point is that for a participant, the young man who's remembering being a baby, if he was a real person or a non-professional who actually remembered that, then it's very curious that story was then used as part of the group of these participants that was discussed at the end of Tuesday night, and then that was then used as the basis of this discussion among the actors. Is that real or not? I mean, it might have a documentary feel to it, but I would suggest that there is an equally plausible interpretation of that, which is it is perhaps all fictionalized. And so I love how the film seems to give us room for either or, and the like, But on the other hand, with the group of people that are non-professionals, there are moments when it becomes very, very real, and it's almost undeniable that, or the evidence is so strong that it's almost likely a truth that they're talking about. An example being the elderly lady and the dancing. Remember when, what was it? It was Thursday. I want to say Thursday or Friday. No, it's Friday. Excuse me. Oh gosh, is it Thursday or Friday? Let's see. Oh gosh, let's see. Excuse me here while I try to recall. Oh no, it's Friday. Excuse me. So it's on Friday. The elderly woman, Tatara Kimiko, she is on the set, and she is right. There's the little girl that's supposed to be playing her, and I forgot to mention this too, but there's a lovely moment too where she's asked about the dance. Do you remember the dance? And she says, oh, I don't know if I remember, but then maybe it went like this, and she actually remembers the dance, right? So that's another example of how she says, I don't really remember, but then she actually remembers it. So it's almost like there's a truth non-truth that is inherent in the linguistic use of the Japanese language there, that is also very reflective of her as a human being. That's really quite sincere and lovely, truth and non-truth, even at the micro level. But that moment is very, very significant because it's a set, and there's a moment when we see the camera linger on her sitting down, and then it's such an odd moment, because then she is being interviewed by someone off camera. It's almost like a documentary moment where the camera is picking up on her, and then maybe she's speaking to someone off camera. And what does she say? She's talking about, this is the day that we'd be filming, and so I think my brother, who's now deceased, and I think he would be very happy. And she's like she's being interviewed off camera by someone off camera. It's like a documentary. So this feels like such a real moment that was then included for whatever reason. We've never seen this style before, and we will never see it again. So it's like the ultimate documentary moment in the film, which is very suggestive to me that her story is indeed real. And she says a little detail in that. I don't know if it's clear, but she says, I went and prayed today at my, she says, butsudan, which I was assuming being, in many households there are little altars. In households that have that practice, or that are Buddhist in terms of religion. There are little altars, or Buddhist altars, that are devoted to deceased family members, and that people will pray as a means of of greeting the deceased and paying respect to the memory of the deceased. Well, she says in that little documentary moment in the film, she says, I said, I prayed to my household Butsudan today, and I told my brother we'd be filming, or that sort of thing, right? And so that is a very interesting moment. That's kind of a moment where reality seems to have it seems that, the cat came out of the bag for one brief moment, right? Because if we think about this whole setup, these people are probably staying in this. The conceit is that they are all gathered here in this what looks like an abandoned school or something, and they're sleeping here, right? And we see, there's one moment on Friday morning when Watanabe-san, the elderly man, is trying to use the hairdryer, and he blows a fuse and the lights go out or something like that. So the assumption is that they are staying here in kind of lodgings that aren't their home. So that's the conceit of the film. Well, if that's the case, then it's very unlikely that the elderly woman would have a little Butsudan altar that she would keep in one of the rooms that she's staying here. I think that's very, very unlikely. So if we were to carry this through, the most reasonable likelihood is that she has the altar in her home and she's sleeping in her home, right? Because that makes sense, because she is making a film with Koreeda called Afterlife. If that's the case, and I think that's the most reasonable way for me anyway to look at that particular moment, then her story is perhaps something that has a strong basis, at least possibility-wise anyway, in truth and what happened. So if that's the case, then I think that is such a complicated or complex moment with her particular story, and it expands to the whole conceit of the film as well, right? Things that we think are real might not necessarily be real. Things that we think are not real might be real. And there's a lot of space in between for that. And I think that complexity and nuance gives this film a true life, and it gives so much possibility for rewatch and rewatch and rewatch. Every time I watch this film, I wonder, is this really the truth? Even if it's a non-actor, is this something that is really something that they are saying from their own memory, or is it something that they have been coached to say, or is it something that they're saying on behalf of the script, or is it something that they're saying for purposes of creating a story that might be cinematic or something like that? It's not nefarious or it's not malicious or anything like that. It's just something that is not really true. Or is it true? There are possibilities either way, I think. And that's true also for the actors and the non-actors too. And that makes this film so fascinating. And I would say that it's all linked to the fact also that whether it's a truth or whether it's a non-truth, either way, there is still a potency and a power and an effectiveness and a kind of cathartic, therapeutic quality, even to the non-truth, the fictionalized account, the story account, that is still very emotionally impactful, right? Even the stories that are told, Watanabe-san and his wife Mochizuki, and how the wife was his former lover, his girlfriend that he lost because he died, or any of these stories that we realize are fiction, that is still very powerful. The Kawashima and his daughter, right? That right, because that is not a real character, but we understand that this is still very impactful for us, and that gives us, I think, a way to the other part of this, which is the idea that this is using cinema. The conceit is that the memories are being recreated in the form of cinema. And the cinema, therefore, is the way in which the memories are then experienced from the outside looking in. And I think that is such a great way to tie into the truth and non-truth, right? Because we see that the memories that are being reconstructed, the examples of the memories that are being reconstructed for Film 1 anyway, we see the flimsy nature of how the special effects are being created. Right? I mean, we see the special effects are being created in camera. So we see the clouds on the wires We see the fact that the set for the park is an actual set. We see the artificial nature, the artificialness, the artifice of how these how these memories are being recreated for film. And it's an interesting thing that we actually, as spectators to this film, we see the making of and how this is coming together. On the one hand, the artifice has the risk of maybe suggesting to some that maybe the memories are being undermined by the fact that this whole process is so obviously fake and artificial, right? The process of making films of these memories, cinematic recreations of these memories, reenactments of these memories too. And add to that the fact that the cinematic recreations of at least what we see anyway, they are not necessarily reflective of how one might subjectively remember something, right? Because, for instance, an example of a memory that we see is Mochizuki. Mochizuki, it's his memory, or it's supposed to be something that is representative of his subjective memory, right? So if you think about it, why would the film therefore be him? Why wouldn't the film be a POV from his point of view of things that he's experienced? Why would it be a sort of an objective view of him as a person? And why would that be his memory on film? The same is true also for Kyoko, the Kyoko Kagawa actress who plays the elder wife, Watanabe's wife. And remember, her memory, that the one that they pull from the archive, is one of her sitting on the park bench, her not as a young woman, but as an elderly woman, sitting, looking at the arms held like this of the man that she loves, Mochizuki, who is in his uniform. And the assumption is he's about to go off to war and to his death, because we know that he will die from his wounds that he will get from, I think he was in the Philippines. So, but that memory is shot not from her point of view, but it's looking at her. So what it's supposed to be a subjective memory captured on film is in fact an objectively presented memory of something that happens, right? And so that is a very odd thing. And so it seems like the cinematic recreations of these memories on the surface might seem to be undermining the subjective intimacy and importance of the memories on the one hand. That it might seem that way on the one hand for the reasons that I just cited. But I would suggest also that even with this artifice, even with this fakeness, there is still a kind of truth that can be engendered by this, by watching the film, right? And I can really believe this if I remember that when I look at a photograph of maybe a picture taken of me when I was very young, maybe I was a kid, I look at a photograph and I see me in the photograph. It's not from my point of view necessarily, if it wasn't taken by me, but it's a photograph of me taken by someone else. So it's not from my own subjective point of view, but it's from the point of view of the person taking the camera, the person who's taking the picture, who is not me, who's not I. I see that though, and I can look at that picture of me and I can see it, and maybe I can recall some memory that is associated with that particular photograph. And then that can lead me to a particular memory that I have that might not necessarily be exactly as seen in the photo, but it becomes the memory, or becomes something that is a lived-in memory that I have. The picture that I see, therefore, jogs my memory in that way, or reminds me of something like that. So if I think of it that way, then I think even if we have the conceit in the film Afterlife of the films that are being made that might seem on their surface to be artificial or fake, if I think of them like the photographs that jog my memory, these films can be seen as being films, even if they're objectively made or made in terms of the non-subjective experience, they can still be seen by the spectators in the room, and they can therefore lead one to recall something that is related to that image, right? They see that particular film and then they realize that memory. And whatever that memory is for them as they lived it, that becomes their memory. And in fact, that's how Nakamura-san, the elderly person in charge, describes it. As soon as you've lived that moment, at that very moment, you'll be transported to the other place. And so it's not the film itself that is the memory, but it's the act of looking at the film that jogs something in one's mind or one's heart or whatever that is the memory, right? So it's not the film, but it's the thing that you remember upon watching the film. If we look at it that way, that is a very powerful way of looking at the dynamic of truth and fiction. So powerful. If we think of it in very base terms, the film is the fiction, but the memory is the kind of truth. And there's a direct relationship between the two. One cannot exist without the other. And so that is the ultimate expression, I think, of this truth, non-truth dynamic that I think is so powerful. It operates on so many different levels, both on the micro and the macro, but here it operates on the macro in the most profound way that I think it really gets at the heart of how I interact with my own mementos and the things that I see around me that jog my own memories and make me recall things in my own life. Very, very powerful stuff. And even if the film is made in a way that is fake or artificial, it doesn't rob it of its power to evoke certain memories in the participants in question. So there's another way of saying even the artifice of the cinema that is being created in the film here, Afterlife, is still incredibly emotional, very powerful, and very, very important. So artifice is just as important as truth. And I think that is the thesis that is carried throughout this film quite consistently and very, very effectively. And to cap off that, there is the great symbol of the moon. Now, do you remember the moon sequences, the moon shots? We see them, we hear the moon mentioned. There's one gentleman who mentions, Takahashi-san, when he mentions the moonlight glinting off of the rails as he was about to contemplate killing himself. But the moon comes quite prominently in two areas. It comes on the end of Thursday night, and when Mochizuki and Shiori are in the hallway, and Mochizuki is looking up, and he sees the moon through some kind of opening in the hallway, and then Shiori joins him, and she looks up as well. It's not, he is obviously very moved by it, but she maybe not as much. And then that's followed later by the Nishimura, the leader of the group, going to her room and trying to maybe convey to her some kind of sagely advice about, looking at the moon from a different point of view or something like that. And then that links to the very last day, Monday, when Shiori in the morning goes up into the hallway before her first real day of on the job, as it were. She looks up and she sees the moon. It's a different shape. There's something quite off about this, because you look and you see it's adjusted and becomes this panel of light that's a fake thing. And you see someone from the roof, the janitor, come down from the roof saying, good morning, good morning. It's a fake. It's not real, right? That's a great moment, right? Because what does it say? What does it say about? It says this idea thing about, I think it says to many things, right? First of all, we see it on Thursday night and we see it on Monday morning, okay? Why would we see a moon shining in the morning? It doesn't make sense, right? Because we don't necessarily think of a bright, sunny Monday morning, and we wouldn't think to see a moon being visible in the dark sky. I mean, that doesn't make sense in terms of daylight, night, our understanding of that. So automatically, when we see that at the very end of the film, something in our mind says, this isn't real, right? And that recalls the earlier scene in the film, Thursday night, when Mochizuki and Shiori are looking up, Mochizuki in particular looking up at the sky, right? What was Mochizuki looking up at the sky at that time on Thursday night? It was nighttime. It wasn't daytime, but it was nighttime. Was it a real moon or was it a fake moon that we saw on Monday morning? if you think about it, he was looking up at night, right? It was probably the real moon. It was probably the real moon. Why do I say this? Well, because the fake moon is kind of glass, right? According to how it looks in the film, it's glass that is the basis of it is there's light that shines from the outside. It goes through the glass, and the glass creates this illusion from the inside looking up that it's the moon. So it can only work if there is some kind of external source of light that's shining through the glass. If it's daytime, then there's the sun. So the idea is the sunlight shines through it and it gives the illusion of being the moon. So that illusion can only exist in the daytime. What about the nighttime? Where is that external source of light coming from if it's not coming from the sun? Because it's not coming from the sun on Thursday night because the sun is not out on Thursday night. Is there some external source of light that we are not aware of? Quite possibly. But if you look at the shot, on the Thursday night moon shot, you can tell that the whole scene around the moon is kind of black, consistently black, which is probably saying to me anyway that that's the real moon against the real black sky that Mochizuki can see through the opening. It's not the fake glass moon that we see on Monday morning. So that is such a profound moment because it throws us into question as to what we saw on Thursday. Was that really real or was it fake? But the more we think about it, the more we realize the possibility that the Thursday night moon was in fact the real moon. But we're not quite sure. There is still the possibility that it was still a fake because we realize that the Monday morning moon is not real at all, but that is also a fake. Were they the same moons? We're not quite sure. But the point is that even with this ambiguity, even with the possibility of something not being real, there is still the profound nature of what it conjures up in us, what it can inspire in us. Even if it's fake, even if it's not real, it can still inspire in us something that is very profound and very powerful. And I think, if we can take that, take a step back further and say that as a kind of metaphor for cinema, fiction cinema, narrative cinema, I think that's very powerful, right? Fiction cinema, narrative cinema, whether it's Wonderful Life or another creative film or another film that you appreciate by a great filmmaker or whatever, if it's a fiction film, it's not real, right? It could be based on real events. Maybe there are some real aspects to it, of course. Maybe there's some quasi-documentary aspects to it. Of course, there are many exceptions to that. But in general, it's probably not real. It's a fiction made-up thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is of any less worth, because it can still conjure up powerful feelings in us. It can affect us, it can change us potentially, so it can really have a great impact on us. And so I think that is at the heart of what is going on with these many various elements in the film Afterlife. It's something that is expressing that not only is truth important, but also the non-truth is just as important. And this interplay between both poles is very fascinating, and it plays itself out in many different sort of variations on the same theme. But still ultimately to the same conclusion that either or, there is still the potential of great emotional impact. Okay, so let's see here. Let me just go to the chat, and because I'm almost done with this chat here, but there are a couple more minor things that I'll talk about, and then that's pretty much all I have to say. But I'll go to the, actually before let me just finish with everything else I'm going to say, and then there's that. So this is my general approach on Afterlife or Wonderful Life. I think this is a really great film on many levels. If I can just end on some very minor, maybe miscellaneous points, and then I'll go to the live chat and we'll call it a day. But just a couple of things. So the title in Japanese, it's called Wonderful Life. It's not called Afterlife. It's called Wonderful Life. Wonderful Life can be translated quite directly as wonderful life, and it has the same meaning as it would in English, wonderful life. Afterlife has more of a maybe life after death kind of possibility or connotation to it that wonderful life doesn't necessarily have, although one can derive a similar connotation from the phrase wonderful life if we remember a film like It's a Wonderful Life, or something like that. And I think the connections aren't necessarily coincidental, if you know what I mean. So at least that's what my hunch is anyway. So there's that, I think, but I think the title "Wonderful Life" doesn't necessarily have a directness in terms of the maybe religious or life after death connotations to it, unless one has maybe Frank Capra on the forefront of one's mind, of course. But there's that, of course. So it really depends on what you prefer. Do you prefer wonderful life or do you prefer afterlife? And I think afterlife gives us a little bit more information about how this process works, the world that is created by the film, etc. Although wonderful life seems to suggest to me that there is a focus more on the idea of looking back, and therefore the focus becomes on memory and the importance of memory when one is thinking of the film under the title Wonderful Life instead of Afterlife. So it's really up to you. I mean, if the film is really about memory and about the idea of memory and less so about the mechanics and the processes of the afterlife, then perhaps the title Wonderful Life is a little bit more apropos than Afterlife. Although there's a kind of marketability in English anyway, in terms of a film that is titled Afterlife than Wonderful Life. Perhaps. So either way, I think either title works quite effectively. But that's an interesting detail, I think, from my point of view anyway, about the Japanese title versus the title that's given to it for English distribution. Speaking of Japaneseness, I would just point your attention also to a number of details that I think are reflective of a kind of Japaneseness or reflection of societal concerns or maybe habits or understandings of a Japanese culture or Japanese language or Japanese maybe sensibilities, for lack of a better word. I've brought up a number already. For example, this idea of self-effacement. When you say, I don't know, I'm not quite sure, but something. So, the man who's talking about the train ride, or the elderly woman talking about, I don't remember how the dance went, but I think it went something like this, and in fact she remembers the entire dance. So there's sort of a sense of self-effacement in the way that people talk sometimes is very important, because it's if anything, it's almost like a way to not brag, or not to bring too much attention to yourself, or not be seen as being overly self-absorbed or something along those lines. And so there's something that is very that is a kind of it is generally a kind of important aspect of speaking in certain situations in Japanese. One has to have certain appreciations of the situation and the people around you when you choose certain words to employ in your language, or choose certain ways to address certain people, etc. And I think that kind of way of speech is very reflective of that. So that's a kind of Japaneseness as well. And there's also one other detail that I thought was so kind of Japanese. There's a kind of Japanese haiku poetry of a certain rigid structure of syllables within certain lines, 3 lines of poetry that have a certain rigid structure called haiku. And the film doesn't operate on any haiku per se, but occasionally during the interview scenes there would be shots of the interviewer writing down notes on a particular interviewee and then going into the interview itself. There's one particular interview, the one about the man who was he was elderly man now, but he was recalling how he was 20 and he was on the cliff and he was contemplating taking his own life. Now, I don't know how clear it is in the English, but in Japanese, it doesn't follow strictly. I don't want to suggest that it is a purely haiku section. It doesn't follow the haiku rhythm strictly. So I don't mean to say that it is, but there's a moment where a note is being taken about this particular man, and let me see if I can find it directly. What he says is, the line is, in English, what he says, what he's writing is, when he was 20 years old, he tried to take his own life atop a cliff or something like that. So that's the what you could, that's what is being written down, and it goes into the interview about the man. He's recalling about how he's standing there and he's recalling memories of his loved ones and the moonlight and all that. But in Japanese, it's a very interesting thing. When you write it, when he's written down, you actually hear it being said aloud. Maybe it's a voiceover. And what is it in Japanese? I'm going to try to get it right here. If my memory is incorrect, please forgive me. But in Japanese, it's 20の時、自殺未遂をした崖の上. If you read it like that, it sounds very close to like a Japanese haiku poem. It's not purely a poem like that because the syllables don't quite match up, but it has a kind of cadence or rhythm that is very much like a traditional, a rigid structure Japanese poem like that. And so even with something that is very much just a very small detail that doesn't really develop into anything further ever again. Still, it's that kind of moment that feels very Japanese. It has a kind of poetic rhythm to it that feels like a Japanese poem in a certain way, even though the contents don't necessarily suggest themselves, at least immediately, to be of a very poetic nature. There's a way of the rhythm and the cadence and the delivery of certain lines that gives it a kind of flavor, if you will, that is very reminiscent of poetry, of the Japanese literary tradition. So those are just some examples that I wanted to bring up of Japanese-ness, if you will. But that's also in the context of a film that I think has a very strong reach, regardless of where one lives and what one's experiences and what one's nationality is. I think this is a film that has a lot of potential for universal reach because of the way in which it approaches memory and our own lives, and the way it tackles this, I think, is very push. Oh gosh, there's one other thing, and I promise I'll finish. So I forgot to mention this as well. So another kind of Japanese-ness, kind of, I suppose, is the Watanabe story, the Watanabe character. I mean, that's another thing as well that I didn't really go into, which is the idea of the videotapes, the use of videotapes to catalog every year of one's life or something. That's a very interesting, kind of odd conceit that is not really explained, except to say, oh, there are videotapes of your life. And when you see the videotapes of Watanabe, they're very almost static and quite, I mean, where was this camera anyway? I mean, was it the eye of God, perhaps? I'm not sure, but it was a very, and they're just placed in a very static way, almost like they're just filmed almost voyeuristically. That's another interesting aspect of the conceit of the film that is never given a full explanation, nor does it need it, because it's not really the point of the film. Incidentally, we get all the tapes of Watanabe, the elderly Watanabe, during his life, right? But that doesn't explain. Oh, I'm sorry. At the early part of the week, when Mochizuki is on the phone to whomever he's calling, ordering the tapes for Watanabe's life, recall that he also orders the tapes for Yamamoto as well, which is interesting. We never see Yamamoto, the man with the glasses who had a very despondent demeanor, and he ended up picking a memory of darkness, right? We never see Yamamoto. We only see, I think, 2 glimpses of him, and then a third if you're counting the very end in the theater. But we never see him experiencing the videotapes, but we do know that videotapes were ordered because Mochizuki said it on the telephone, together with his ordering of the videotapes for Watanabe-san. And so, but we only get the videotapes for Watanabe-san, which is very interesting. But it's Watanabe's life, right, that we get. We always get the Watanabe story from his point of view, which is very interesting too, because remember on Saturday, when Shiori, the young girl, and Mochizuki, they're together, and Shiori is putting together what happened to Watanabe's wife, right? One of the things that they do is they get the film that was Watanabe's wife's memory. Kyoko, that was her memory, and it was the memory of her on the bench with Mochizuki in the uniform with his hands like clasped like this. Okay, so there's that. And then remember what they do. They get a videotape, and they see the videotape, and it's the young Mochizuki and the young Kyoko together on the bench. This is a very interesting detail. Whose life is that videotape taken from? It can't be from Watanabe's life, right? Because Watanabe is not in that. That wasn't part of Watanabe's life. It was only Kyoko's life or Mochizuki's life. We never got a sense that Mochizuki had his videotapes of his life. And did they order Kyoko's life on videotape as well? We never get a scene of Shada like that. And I guess that's the assumption, but that's an interesting detail that we never really get clarity on. But I don't think we need clarity on that detail anyway, because by that point we understand how the whole operation works as far as the videotapes are concerned. But an interesting thing about the videotapes is there's a shot in Watanabe's life of him after he is married. He is sitting in a maybe a living room on the floor, kind of tatami style floor, and the background is the kitchen, and the wife is seen making some meal and then coming in to the table. The camera is from a low angle. It's staged, framed very much like a Yasujiro Ozu film. I think a lot of people have commented on this. I think rightly so, because it does feel like a Yasujiro Ozu framed way of looking at this particular moment. That's a recreation of one moment in Watanabe's life. That's a very interesting detail, because it's the young Watanabe and the young Kyoko in that Ozu framed video moment. Okay, it's very interesting too, because the young Kyoko, if you recall, is then played by the actress named Kyoko Kagawa as the elderly Kyoko. So the young Kyoko is played by one particular actress, and then the elderly Kyoko is played by the actress Kyoko Kagawa. Now, Kyoko Kagawa is probably someone that is very familiar to anyone who knows Japanese cinema, Kurosawa films. She's appeared in many Kurosawa films. She, in fact, appeared, if you know Ozu films, she appeared in one of Ozu's most famous films, Tokyo Story. And so the role that she plays in Tokyo Story is a little bit different to the role of Kyoko here in Afterlife, granted, but still there's an Ozu connection in a kind of indirect way. The character of Kyoko is played played by Kyoko Kagawa in the elderly version of that character. But the younger version of the character, although it's played by a different actor, is still framed in a way that's very Ozu-esque, which is also in turn connected to the actor Kyoko Kagawa, who plays the older version of Kyoko. And she brings with her, of course, this huge presence of Japanese cinema and the weight and heft of that, and sort of the importance of the history of that as well. So that's another lovely link, I think, to kind of a Japaneseness, this time in the context of Japanese cinema. Okay, so I am pretty much done with what it is I want to say about this film. So let me now just go here and go from there. So let's see here. Zyrother says, even the building is a unique character. Yes, I agree. There are so many other moments that I didn't get into, like the building, the band. There's a moment where the group is practicing band, and you're not quite sure why. Why would they be? Is this a new song that they're practicing? I'm not sure. Maybe it is. I don't know. But it's an interesting moment. Wolfgrat says, my favorite of the newly dead is the admittedly cussed Yusuke. Okay. Jonas Wilstrup said, this is a rare occurrence for me where I immediately got thinking about that theme, my memories, and I struggled. It engaged me so fast in that way. Yes, I think this film has this great impact that way that you're describing, my friend. Wolfgrat says, the gentleman who just wants to be 10 and forget everything afterwards. Yes, yes. Paul Emery says, it provoked me consider my own memories. And Jonas says, I think it's him, Paul. To Paul, you say, me too. Wolfgat says, yes, the one they warn against identifying with lest they lose their usefulness. Okay, I'm just going to keep scrolling down here. Let's see, just scrolling down. There's a great conversation here going on. Wonderful. Okay. Zyrother says, is it a memory or a memory of a memory? Let's see. Zyrother's talking about the videotapes. Yes. You say the videotapes are a broad and general overview of what happened each year, not the tiny details. Actually, I would very gently, very gently, just push back very slightly on that. I think it actually focuses in on the minutia, at least in the stuff that we see. Why do I mean that? Well, there's one example of the salaryman Watanabe, and we see him, and the voiceover over that scene. I mean, the scene is him in his office desk, just reading the paper, and then he goes to the window. The voiceover is just, he's describing his life. He had a so-so education, so-so upbringing, so-so job, so-so marriage, or something, that sort of thing. But the image on the video is like him sitting, kind of rustling the paper, doing that thing, just sitting there, going to the window, seeing something he noticed in the window. He goes to his desk, picks up what sounds like a camera, and he takes a picture with it sounds like a click of a camera or something. I don't think it's binoculars, because there's a click of something that sounds like a camera. So that seems to me to be like a lot of minutia, very much so, which is a very interesting way. It really poses the question as to what these videotapes are, how were they taken, who took them, what was the choice of taking them, were all the details of one's life, even the most intimate details, also taken? I mean, right? I mean, there are things that one does in one's life that are very, very private, right? So were those taken as well? I mean, what about those? And that's a kind of interesting thing. Oh, that also brings me to a very interesting question that I don't think the film necessarily poses. If one in this world were to choose a memory that, let's say, involved a very, very maybe intimate, let's say, sexual moment or something like that, and that was the memory that was chosen, will that memory have to be recreated? For instance, the old man who's talking about, like all the women that he slept with, right? If he chose, and he ended up choosing a different memory entirely. He chose a memory about his daughter. But if someone chose a memory that was, let's say, an intimate sexual moment, I think there's nothing that's inherently wrong with choosing that memory, right? I mean, because a moment is a moment. It's something that you can remember, regardless of what its actual contents are and what one that is not you might think of that particular content, right? So there's that. But if one wanted, let's say, to have an intimate sexual encounter as being one's final, ultimate memory to have for eternity, is that going to get recreated in this world? If so, then is that going to be seen by everyone in the theater? I mean, that's what I was kind of getting at when I was talking at the very beginning of this about the kind of the moral ambiguity of this whole setup to begin with. I mean, it's really odd to ask a bunch of people to watch the memories of others and then to go from there. Even though afterward they're probably all going to be dispersed into the other world, never to see each other again or something like that. I don't know. But there seems to be something quite interesting about that prospect. It's never brought up in the film, nor does it have to be. But I mean, the videotapes also bring up that issue. Like, do they show every little detail right down to the very, very, very private and intimate? I mean, it seems like they possibly could, but oh well. That's not the point of the film, of course. But it's still great points I wrote there. Excellent point. Let's see. All right, just keep going, and I'm just keep going here. I'm just going to scroll down. I'm skipping a lot of comments here, so I apologize. All right. Gosh. Oh gosh, let's see. Just skipping down here. Sorry about this. This is a great conversation. I'm scrolling down here. I'm just impressed as always by this here. There's a discussion about Shiori, and I think about her and her role and how she was assertive, perhaps. But I think she did the right thing when it came to convincing the young high school girl to choose a different memory than Disneyland. Let's see. David Griffin is here. Hello, David, my friend. How are you doing? Gloin to Hobbit asks, Daisuke, would you categorize Afterlife as a mockumentary? No, not necessarily. That's a little bit of a difficult question. I would categorize it as a kind of. I don't think it doesn't overtly purport itself to be a documentary. That's the difference, I think. I think something like This Is Spinal Tap has it as a documentary feel that's very obvious. Here, there's something of the conceit is at one extra layer that is one step removed from it being a kind of purported documentary. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a mockumentary per se, although it does have elements to it that could be suggestive of that kind of subgenre. Let's see. All right, I'm just skipping around here. I'm so sorry. Let's see. Just skipping around. All right. Okay. There's a great discussion here. Jonathan McCrory says the film feels like a reflection on atheism. That's an interesting way of putting it. Atheism. I don't. Again, I think that's a good point. I wouldn't. I personally, I think that's a great way of looking at it. I personally wouldn't necessarily go that direction fully, to the extent that I don't think the film is a direct discussion either way. Because we never get any of the specific mechanics of how this place actually works. And because we don't get the specific mechanics of how this place actually works, we never get a sense of where this film lies in terms of its statement on the existence of God or not. And so, let's see here. All right, there you go. So that's why I wouldn't necessarily know if I could go so far to say it's a reflection on atheism, but it certainly has that possibility. Let me put it that way. So I think, in that sense, I think what you're saying is right on the money when it comes to how to possibility as to how to view this film. Very well done. Let's see here. All right, I'm just skipping around here. So if I've skipped your comment or Gary Yudman says the camera moves around quite a bit during the filmmaking section. Yes, it has a kind of cinema verite feel to it. It has this sort of throughout the film, actually, even from the opening shot, when you have the shot of the feet going up the steps, Monday. There's a kind of verite feeling, and it cuts to a shot of them from the front, and it follows them into the office, or the back office, and it just follows all the people in, I think it's one continuous shot in the office. And so there are certain moments of cinema verite type of camera work, but it's definitely quite emphasized in the latter half of the week, the Thursday, Friday, when the filmmaking process is starting, I think, Wednesday night, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, when the filmmaking process is starting in full. Let's see. Satori says, fantastic movie, and Susumu Terajima is really good. So that's the actor who plays Kawashima, and System Terajima is probably also maybe very recognizable. I mean, he's been in many films of Takeshi Kitano, for example. One of his, I love, he's probably the best thing about the Kitano's film Brother. That's, oh gosh, oh, that would be another great film to talk about. Okay, so I'm sorry, but you're right. Synergy is fantastic, fantastic, so great. Let's see here. Okay, just skipping around. Sean Wong, 13D. Is cinema the most profound medium to explore time? I mean, it's a very great question. Let's see here. FP9623 is here. Our dear friend, hello. My dear friend, I hope you are well. I hope you are well, my friend. Razor Wire Reviews, Luke, our dear friend and my dear friend and hero. It's nice to see you. I hope you're well. Razor Wire Reviews has also talked about this film Afterlife. Luke has, I think, he and Connie, I think, have a great reaction to this. And so check out Razor Wire Reviews for that and for everything else, of course, because it's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. One of the best out there. One of the, I mean, I've mentioned it before, but a good thing is worth repeating, right? Because Razor Wire Reviews is one of the channels that I watched a lot, before I started my own channel here. So in many ways, if Razor Wire Reviews wasn't around, then my YouTube channel wouldn't be around here. That's the truth. And so I owe Razor Wire Reviews a lot, absolutely a lot. And so not only for all the support that he's shown me, but also, I think, more importantly, the great stuff that he does and the great enthusiasm that he shows on a constant basis for cinema, this thing that we all love. So, Razor Wire Reviews, check out that channel. But the likelihood is that if you know my channel, you already know Razor Wire Reviews. You already know his channel anyway, so you don't even need my saying it, because you already know about it. But just in case you don't, check it out, because it's fantastic. All right, so I'm just skipping down here because I'm very sorry, because I'm going to it's almost 2 a.m. So I've been talking for 12, 1, 2, almost 3 hours here. So I admit that I'm, the lethargy is beginning to kick in. So I will just, if I've skipped over your comment, I apologize. If I'm just trying to get all the names here, if I've skipped over just mentioning your name also, I apologize too. But Max Alcerda is here. Thank you very much, Max. It's nice to see you. Let's see here. Zay Moderno, hello. And thank you very much for your comment. It's very kind of you, Zay. I hope you're well. Let's see. Akira Kurosawa. I've never seen this film, but it looks great. As I recommend it, Akira Kurosawa. Great name, by the way. Trey Edwards, I'll come back and watch from the beginning. Thank you very much, my friend. I hope you're well. Pete, 1972 is here. Hello. It's nice to see you, my friend. I hope you're well. Please take good care of yourself. To all of you, my friends, please take good care of yourselves. And let's see, I'm just going to go through this chat one more time, just to make sure I have gotten everyone. If I skipped you, and you're still here, just maybe leave a comment in the live chat. Oh, Erwin is here. Erwin Ritamales is here. Hello, my friend. Rourke Productions is here from Washington, D.C. Gavam, Sadri, Gavam, hello, it's here. It's nice to see. Do you feel that Koreeda peaked with Still Walking or Shoplifters? That is a question I'd love to answer. Let me think about it. I don't know if I can answer that. It's very complicated. Both fantastic works. I'd love to talk about more Koreeda later, but let's see here. Oh gosh, I don't want to. I'm just going back up through here. Just want to make sure I've gotten everyone. Theodore, let's see. Theodore is here. Thank you very much. Theodore, it's nice to see you. It's nice to see you, my friend. Oh, gosh. Stefanos is here. Hello. It's nice to see you. You asked, what is your favorite element of the film? I love its cinematography so much. Cinematography is great. Absolutely great. My favorite element, I don't know. I think it's just its overall inventiveness and its ability to surprise. There's something, I've mentioned it before, but it's, the film Citizen Kane, right? Citizen Kane is often described as being a film that you can watch many, many times and learn something new, pick up something new every single time. I feel the same way about this film, Afterlife. Every time I see it, I pick up something new every single time, without fail. So I'm actually glad I had this extra week. Last week I tried to do the live stream on this film and it didn't work out. So I'm actually glad because I had an extra week to really sit with this film again and absorb it and feel it. And there were some new discoveries that I made just with the extra watch of this. And I think it was wonderful to have. And I'm sure that when I watch it again, I'll discover more things. And so that's one of the great things about this. Andreas 1999, I think I said hello, just in case I didn't. It's nice to see you, my friend. I hope you're well. So I hope I got everyone. Oh gosh, if I didn't get you to, if I didn't say hello, I'm so sorry, but I hope I got everyone. If not, please, I hope you can accept my apologies. I hope I hope you can forgive my rudeness, but it's not intentional. And you can always leave a comment in the comment section as a comment to this video or any other video, and we can go from there. Okay, my friends, so let's wind down this conversation. So that was Afterlife, but that's just scratching the surface. As I would suggest, this is a film that is so worth watching and so rewarding upon rewatch and rewatch and rewatch. I feel that way about many films, but this is the one that is very much like that. It works. There are ambiguities and complexities. There are things that might seem negative or rather than positive, but even the seemingly negative things add to add different layers to this that make this so nuanced and fresh every single time I watch it, and it provides a very emotional arc in many ways for the things that it's presenting, but it also gives a great weight to a lot of things that can be potentially relevant to my own life and how I look back on what it is I've done and what it is I remember and the things that I cherish in my heart as memories, etc. So that is Afterlife. So thank you very much, my friends, for joining this live stream. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed myself immensely. I thought this was a lot of fun, and thank you very much for giving me this great opportunity. Really great. I owe you a lot, my friends. I really do. So thank you very much for, as always, being patient with me. Once again, thank you very much for being patient with me, especially considering that this live stream didn't work out last week. And so it looks like we went without a hitch this time. So thank you. Thank you to the YouTube gods for looking out for this live stream. I really appreciate it. Next week, next Saturday, same time, same place, we will be talking about the film Vertigo. Seemingly a different kettle of fish altogether. But I would suggest that there are some similarities in terms of how human psychology, on a very general scale, is being presented, which is not dissimilar, I would suggest, from something that might be a way of interpreting this film. But I look forward to that discussion. If you are interested, please feel free to join us for that discussion on Vertigo next Saturday. I will make an announcement beforehand about it. So, and if you don't manage to make it, that's fine too. There's no problem at all. Whatever works for your schedule, my friends, whatever it is you want to do, I will be very happy to accommodate to the best of my ability. All right. So, with that, my friends, thank you very much. And once again, please take good care of yourselves. It's very important, of course, to take good care of yourselves, especially now. You know what I mean. And so, please be well. And my warmest wishes to you wherever you are in the world. And I hope you are taking good care of yourselves, as I'm sure you are. And I hope that the same is true for the people around you. I hope nothing but the best. And my warmest regards to all. Please take good care of yourselves. Be well. And I look forward to seeing you all again very, very soon. My friends, thank you and cheers. Okay. Thank you very much. So I will. Okay. Thank you, my friends, for joining. That was a lot of fun. I, uh, I mean, this is a film that I hope in the discussion, I hope it was clear in how I was talking that I really, really love this film. I really do. And I hope if you haven't seen it, and you're still here, I'm sorry if the discussion spoiled it for you. I'm really, really sorry. I hope it wasn't. But I would still encourage you to see the film because it is definitely worth watching. This is such a great, great, profound work that is not afraid to be ambiguous. And I think that's one of the great things about it. Okay, my friends. Let's see here. Oh gosh, now I'm just. I should say goodbye, but I just want to just say one more time. Uh, please be well, my friends. Please take good care of yourselves. I really, really mean that. That's the most important thing. Most important thing. And uh, yeah, let's just continue to enjoy movies and talk about movies and talk about life. Enjoy the time that we have and just have fun. And if you have any good recommendations for films, please let me know. As always, my friends, it's great to hear from you and your recommendations and anything you have to say. I am always happy to listen. So, my friends, with that, thank you and cheers. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are, or great rest of your evening, whatever the case may be. Thank you.